Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure of speaking to the one and only Layman Pascal again. So I'm absolutely delighted. And he is so freaking stylish with the cowboy hat. I feel like I should have worn a bandana and we would have been like a club. You look like the guy off of No Country for Old Men. So you're ready for that, Layman Pascal, and like a Cormac McCarthy. So well done to you, sir. And I had such a blast speaking with him before. And we talked at the end a little bit about the problem of scale. What does it look like to scale, say, enjoyment of subconscious? We were talking at the end about the need to enjoy one's subconscious, to enjoy the surprise that it comes out of it. I think that gets linked to intrinsic motivation. We also talked a lot about a collection of, you could say, practices that are tied into what it means to enjoy one's subconscious, or to engage in meta shamanism, or to be someone who's, say, an absolute knower. And I do think in this conversation, there are quite a number of phrases that different people use. You know, we've talked about the Nietzsche's child. We talk about the absolute knower, Gurdjieffian, all of these different things. And so I may stick to the child in Nietzsche, which is the idea of creating one's own values, being intrinsically motivated, and also kind of being a home for the kind of mystery that can come out. So but there's this question. It's quite obvious that individuals can do this. You know, we've seen individuals do this. They can be a child in this sense. But the question that lurks is, can it spread? Can the majority of people be children? Should that even be desirable? Is that a good thing? There's this one sense in which, if we accept the metacrisis framing, there's an idea that there needs to be some sort of evolution or negation, sublation of people's rational processes. The way I understand Mr. Schleiermacher is the Schleienberg. I always say Schleiermacher. That's like the theologian. I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm really sorry about that. But with the metacrisis, it's like a game theory thing, right? Where if everyone does what is rational, you end up with a suboptimal result. It's a Nash equilibrium. So how do you change people's sense of rationality so you don't end up in that? You also have Daniel Frege talking about ontological design, where we're already in an ontological war, and you better fight or you're going to be changed. There's ideas of the need to do these things, or just generally what belonging again talks about. If you don't have givens, then there's existential anxiety, and you need to be able to enjoy the uncertainty, to find a belonging in the lack of belonging. And we know there are individuals who can do all of these things. That doesn't seem to be the debate. And it definitely seems like it's capable of making individual or small communities that can cultivate people that can do this kind of thing. But the question that lurks is it always limited? Can it be spread? What would it look like to spread? Is it necessary to spread? I also think about Jim Rutt talking about how society is fragile, and if you don't spread anti-fragility, it's only a matter of time before the solar flare breaks everything. So all of these seem to be saying that something needs to spread or scale. And it's interesting to think that there might be a difference actually between scale and spread. And maybe we'll talk about that later. But there's this idea that something needs to scale, something needs to spread. And the question is, what is that something? Is it even possible? Should we be concerned with it? And so that's kind of the framing of the discussion. I'll give it to you to respond to if you think it's a valid inquiry, if you think there is something that could be scaled, what we can talk about. But the other thing I left you on last time is that interesting quote from Osho, where in his book on freedom, he basically says he's not in favor of revolution, because what we should really worry about is the elevation of consciousness. You know, and that's a vague phrase, but I think we generally know what he means. And creating children. And the idea is that if you elevate consciousness, then government, the need for institutions, the need for systems kind of melts away. It's not that it's a kind of, it's not a revolution, because it's almost like where Edmund Burke warns, if you revolt, you tend to make things worse because you don't know what you're going to replace it with. It's that conservative argument you hear that seems to have legitimacy, right? So there's this question of how do you change the system without engaging in a revolution that just makes everything worse, from your Burkes and your Tocquevilles and all that different stuff. And Osho seems to be saying, well, it's by elevating consciousness, and that's going to change the system, and that's how you worry about it. So don't worry about changing the system. Don't even, in a sense, it's like, don't even worry about scaling an institution. Just worry about elevating consciousness, and things will take care of itself. Well, is that naive? Is that true? Is there truth to it? Because it almost sounds like the American idea that the key to democracy is spreading education. If everyone was educated, then everything would work out. Well, that seems true, but then the question is, what are the conditions of education? What are the material conditions of education? And then there's the debate with Marx on if you change material conditions first, or if you change ideas first, and then How do you scale, et cetera, so forth. So these are all the thoughts I'm dealing with. I think this is a very, very pressing topic. I also appreciated your conversation with Brendan, Dr. Vervaeke, on the scaling of the artful scaling of a religion that's not a religion. And I appreciate you having that conversation because it's getting at the heart of this issue that I think is so pressing. So Layman Pascal, thank you for being here today, sir.
Yeah, great to see you. Happy to be back. The Osho quote is really an interesting one because we as a society and as individuals often oscillate back and forth between whether we want to concentrate our efforts on some kind of internal change for ourselves, for our children, for our families, or whether we want to focus on how larger systemic modifications are going to occur. Now, in something like integral theory, they define consciousness extremely broadly so that it applies to the so-called depth both of social systems and of individual interiors. I think you need both those dimensions in play because they're co-creating each other, which is, on the one hand, a problem because they trap each other in place, but on the other hand, it gives you two leverage points to change the system. You can come in at either side. There's a great quote from Wilhelm Reich that goes something like, if people are healthy and intelligent and work together to solve common problems, then it doesn't matter what kind of government you have. And if people are not healthy and intelligent and don't work together to solve common problems, then it doesn't matter what kind of government you have. Right? There's a lot of truth to that, but the kind of government you have largely determines whether or not people are going to be in one of those situations or the other. The ontological design question is very much like that. Well, these two types of reality co-create each other. Things like feng shui are very interesting things to explore because people are using the modification of physical elements of their immediate environment to try to determine their psychology, their feelings, their relationships, their general sensibility. And we know that like from John Vervaeke's point of view, one of the things that the new cognitive science is really pushing is this notion that what we want to call mind is essentially extended. It has to do with all of the objects in which we have meaningful investments and all of the types of material, energetic, and informational processes that support or disrupt our ability to function and our state of mind. So I don't think you can have one without the other. When it comes to scaling up, I think we need to look very closely at which things we need to scale up and which things we need to scale down, right? We don't want to scale up things that can be solved at lower scales. We want to maximize the number of things that are solved at lower scales so that we're clear about which things have to be solved at higher scales. And then we have to do something like a qualitative analysis of what we want to scale up. It's not just maybe this is the age for the eternal developmental childhood of the human being to be scaled up. Yes, if it's a healthy childhood, and possibly only for a subset of the species. Right. The notion of Nietzsche's children fits in with Nietzsche's overall perspective, which is he's not writing for everyone. He's not making his proposals for the general species. If we come back to the question of shamanism, it's not for everybody. It may be for a larger number of people than we've hitherto been doing it for. And they have to work in tandem with the well-being of everybody else. And the well-being of everybody else does not necessarily look like the same well-being as it does for these sets. So we need a typologically distributed, healthy, qualitatively clarified version of organization that can operate at multiple scales and a notion of which things we want to push down the scale and which things we want to push up the scale. If we had that, we could begin to ask this question intelligibly. But I think if we don't have a framing like that, then questions of scale are really pretty nebulous and don't lead us very far.
Excellent. There's always a risk of scale creating hierarchy, right? Where some people are better than others, but then if you have no hierarchy, that's everything could be mediocre, right? So there's some sort of tension between, like you say, there's a kind of idea where maybe this is inherently limited, this kind of childhood, because you're right, Nietzsche's speaking to a limited group of people. But then at the same time, you have all these voices speaking as if, well, there's something that has to change on a bigger scale, the whole game B conversation, right? And so if indeed what we'll just say what the liminal web does, if you grant me that language, is create children, we'll just use that language because everyone has different languages. If that is inherently limited, which it may be, then that would not address the concerns of, say, the meta crisis or Jim Rudd. And so what we're doing here is different from whatever would address that. May be the case. That's option one, right? Option two has something where it's like, well, there is something about what the liminal web does that is part of the conversation. Because what I understand, Daniel Smackenberg, I got it. Science says Schleiermacher. I'm imagining Karl Barth in a fight with that guy, Smackenberg, who I enjoyed listening to. There's a sense in him that the very structure of rationality and thought itself is what leads to the Nash equilibrium, because he's big on the game theory and big on the way that thought itself structures us to these suboptimal results. And by suboptimal, we might mean the apocalypse, because that's certainly suboptimal. Well, that seems to be a collective conscious change, not just a limited change that would be needed, right? But what he's talking about is a change in thinking, which I would associate with childhood, right? So what the liminal web does seems to be what is needed for addressing with the meta crisis on scale. So there's a few options here. You say, well, there's no way to do it, so game over. Two, you say, well, the meta crisis doesn't exist, or it's not something we should worry about because it will take care of itself. And that's a very live option. You can always say the world is always about to end. There's always, something is always burning. So we have to be careful to speak that way. And that's a very valid option. And then third, it could be that actually doing whatever it is the liminal web does is creating the conditions to change people to deal with that. And then the question is, can you spread it without losing the quality? Well, history is a long story of spread equals loss of quality, you can look at religion, right? You were talking about this with Brendan and Vervaeke, and I really like this idea of the stack because it does seem you have to have all levels informing one another. I think, again, I'll speak out of Christianity because it's one I know a little better. When Paul is talking about like a fivefold ministry, like you have priests, preachers, missionaries, all these different people, the idea is there are different tasks with different responsibilities, and all of them are equally important. And if they don't play their role, we're in huge trouble. Likewise, you can have the magistrate versus the layman, right? Well, it's really, really difficult for the magistrate with time not to become more important than the layman. It's really difficult for the Protestant not to see the preacher as holier than everyone else in the crowd, right? And so there tends to be something about human nature that creates a certain hierarchy where it's not a stack of every level working on every level. There's an idea that who's ever at the top is better than everyone else. And then, of course, in economics, if the person at the top has all the money and power, then there's a sense where they practically are more capable and more controlling than everyone else, right? So there's something about it seemingly is human nature to make this mistake in some way, right? Or it's the nature of economics and government to give some people more power than other people, right? So that would speak that if you want to stop that, you have to what? Change human rationality, human thinking, which is, again, what the liminal web seems to be doing. So there's either the option, I guess I'll just throw it back at you to respond to it. There's the option that the meta crisis is not something to worry about, that it's, you just don't worry about it, and instead just worry about the liminal web and your own practices, which has qualitative changes on individuals, and you worry about individual transformation, and then those individuals will network effect with all the other people that they do. Or you start asking the question, what would it mean to spread childhood? Is that possible? And I think you also asked a really good question of the particular things we want to scale. So maybe that's a way to start. What is it maybe that can be scaled and should be scaled? And do we think there's some truth to the fragility of the system, Jim Rutt, the meta crisis, the kind of the notion that capitalism is pathological, ontological design, et cetera, so forth. So those are thoughts that come to mind.
I think the system, it's an interesting thing. It definitely is fragile. And I think the civilization structure that we've set up, despite the virtues that are nested in the vaunted liberal values of modernity, creates a situation in which groups and individuals pursuing those values tend to parasitize and undermine each other. So that the kind of system we have is always at risk of tearing itself apart and sabotaging its own processes, of government working against media, corporations working against government, and things like that. So that can go a long way if there's additional work being done to bring people together in some deep and meaningful way as a shared spirit. If you have institutions and processes to do that, then maybe that can hold together. But in the absence of those processes, the inherent fragility will probably tear that thing apart. What we want to scale up, I think, are the let's say, the automated evaluation processes. I mean, a lot of this, when you're speaking, and I know we've touched on the trust crisis together in discussions, I was thinking of the term the evaluation crisis. So for individuals, there's a kind of problem associated with our normal habits of reasoning. And that problem is that it might not get us to values that satisfy ourselves and our loved ones over various ranges of time. So we have to do other practices that lead our reason to be organized around values that are actual and instantiatable values. There's something similar in groups and systems, is how do they evaluate each other? How do we know we're getting the right person for the right position? If we have a so-called meritocracy, how do you know that the person who's made it to the top of the hierarchy of the banking system has the merit of being a good banker versus the merit of being able to insulate himself from the negative consequences of his own actions or something like that? So this process of evaluation is huge. We know that a lot of our social ills have come from ineffective evaluation processes. We decide that somebody is unsuited to a position merely because of gender, skin color, accent, something like that. We've often used these simple external markers to evaluate people in some process. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be evaluating people. We need the right people in the right positions, but we're not sampling broadly and we're not doing evaluation correctly. Then it comes to something like the kind of automated procedures that we're using to run our system, to elect people, to make collective decisions in legislative bodies. These are largely automated procedures. Are they giving us the results we want? Are they correctly evaluating the problem? Are they correctly evaluating the solution? Are they correctly evaluating who should temporarily steward the system that we have? Things like that. So there's a lot of issues around, let's say, just this most simplistic one, which is voting reform. Does a two-party majoritarian system in which money is equivalent to speech and control of mainstream media rests in a small number of hands, is that likely to be able to evaluate properly who should be running the system in order to face the problems that we face? And so that's a situation in which there's a problem of evaluation that needs to be scaled up. We can't solve that problem just by having people who are better evaluators. We also need the systems people are using to be better evaluators, because those systems have a quasi-autonomous life of their own. And those lives will either help or hinder the development of individual reason and enhanced evaluation capacity. But I think more importantly, they determine the scale at which we can implement new solutions. So this is the classic, say, religious problem. Assuming you actually had a set of doctrines and psychotechnologies that could encourage individuals over time to become better evaluators and sort of trans reasoners in some responsible fashion. Could that be implemented fast enough at this point in history to stop the most egregious effects of the meta crisis? Probably not. So in order to deal with the timeframes we're being given, we would definitely need a scaled up change in the collective evaluating process so that it could run in its semi-automated way, that it could bypass the current state of the individuals, and it could help generate the conditions under which the individual transformation of reason begins to flourish more widely.
Excellent answer. I believe it was David Reef, the son of Philip Reef and Susan Sontag. He said the problem with the internet is you have to be an expert to know what's true or false on the internet. And he called it the evaluation problem. He said he basically was saying the internet's useless because unless you are a medical expert, you don't know what is fake news versus false news, fact, truth. And he said this in the early 2000s, I believe. This was kind of predicting a lot of the problem of evaluation. I really, really like as well your language of evaluation, because that's not merely intellect. It's a middle ground between concrete and abstract, right? It's not merely like abstract notions. You have to observe, you have to contemplate, you have to think. It's a full intellectual, but also concrete act. Aristotle in the Nicean Ethics basically suggests that all ethical action requires judgment. Aquinas basically says that judgment is the final intellectual act. It's basically impossible, though, to use the word judgment now without it having negative connotation. And so for Aristotle, basically, ethics has a whole lot to do with the ability to evaluate. And often people will call it value ethics, but I think the value ethics can actually miss what is the central ethical act for Aristotle, which is the ability to evaluate the good in a live situation. You cannot have value ethics without evaluation. And so, evaluation. And so I think focusing on this question of evaluation is quite good. I think it is also very good because it is open, right? You're saying everyone needs their own emergent capacities within their particular situations to make judgments on what is best and to follow through, right? I think also the thing I'll say, there's always a problem with conversations about scale, because in a way you're talking about changing the world, right? Or you're changing people. Well, that's always possibly totalitarian, right? You have, oh, I know how we're going to fix things. Game A is evil. You get rid of game A and cause mass poverty, right? There's something we say, well, competition is bad. We need to get rid of competition. You get rid of competition. It turns out that there were positive emergent results from competition that now you've gotten rid of. And you say, well, we're against rivalrous competition, not all competition. Well, how do you make those distinctions? Oh, wait, it comes down to evaluation. And actually, I do like that too, Layman, because there's increasingly, I think we mentioned it last time, there's increasingly a sense that the answer is always a kind of bothness. It's not that the conservatives are totally wrong or the liberals are totally wrong. It's not freedom or equality, it's both. Well, if it's bothness, then it all comes down to a judgment or an evaluation of the proportion. So evaluation becomes everything, because that is the speculative reasoning in Hegel, of which then is implemented in terms of evaluation. So I think on that question, what would it mean to scale evaluation? Which then that might be the language to use instead of childhood, because there is something about evaluation, because the term child might have an elitist aim, and maybe that's impossible. Maybe that's too high of a fruit. Maybe instead the question is, what would it look like to scale higher capacities of evaluation? Well, then is that an education question? And then, of course, the question becomes, what are the practices and skills of which generate evaluation? Is it a particular school system? Is it a particular use of free time? Is it leisure in a Joseph Piper sense that then helps people learn evaluation? And of course, there's a tension here, because probably people in power are not too eager to train those below them to evaluate well, because it would be a threat to their power, right? So how do you actually teach evaluation? And then, of course, what is evaluation? What are you evaluating? That's always the tension with value ethics. If you say, well, I'm evaluating that this is good. Oh, according to what? And that's why you end up with the temptation of utilitarianism, because you can say, well, it reduces pain. We all agree that the experience of pain sucks. Therefore, if we reduce it, that's good. But when you start evaluating, say, anti-fragility, or evaluating, I know in your talk with scaling religion, there's this sense that the saint, if you will, has something, you see something you want. And you go, oh, I want that. And you can't put it into words, right? That kind of X variable that's present. And that seems to be very important. So how do you have people evaluate that? Because I do have this question. Well, a way to approach this. So Brendan was emphasizing beauty, the ability to have beauty to kind of attract you in. Are there training you need to go through to experience beauty? Or is the experience of beauty self-evident? Does it force evaluation of itself as beautiful? Likewise, is sainthood, or the X variable, well, let's call it the X variable. Does the experience of the X variable force an evaluation to acknowledge the X variable? Or is there certain training that a person has to go through to be able to experience beauty, as distinct from, say, pretty, right? Like anyone can see a sunset and say that's pretty. But beauty, as Brendan was describing, and I took in more of the Dante kind of theological sense of this ultra mystery that's kind of pulling you in, right? Let's say, for example, if someone encounters someone who enjoys their subconscious, who actually has that intrinsic motivation, does that person just automatically experience and evaluate that person as different? Or are they only so able to do that because they've done certain training to so be able to evaluate that person? Is it self-evident? That's how the founding fathers in America put it. They said some truths are self-evident. Are they? Because I guess I'll put it this way. Are there things that are self-evident? Or is everything only evident given certain conditioning, which is a result of going through certain material conditions that train that conditioning? Because if we say that beauty is not self-evident, or that the X variable is not self-evident, that would mean that people need to be able to train, which would be the training of evaluation. Or does the experience of, say, the X variable or beauty or the infinites, the three infinites, is actually that experience what trains you to evaluate better? Because that's also possible. The very experience of a saint may go, wait a minute, the world is a place where saints are possible. Why don't I see them more often? And then now you're motivated to go evaluate. So is there a self-evident? Does it teach you to evaluate? Do you have to learn how to evaluate the saint or beauty? And I do think focusing on evaluation is quite lovely, because then it's not like, oh, just go be smarter. Well, smart people can suck at evaluation. That's like Paul Johnson or Thomas Sowell talking about intellectuals who suck at evaluation. Also, I meant to say the great problem is Hayek's knowledge problem, right? Like, you can be the smartest cat on planet Earth, but if you don't work at the McDonald's down the street, you don't know how many plastic straws they need to order next week, right? Like, the majority of knowledge is particular knowledge, not abstract knowledge. So being really, really smart ain't going to make much of a difference. You have to be in the situation to evaluate what's best. So another reason I think evaluation is a good emphasis is because it helps avoid the knowledge problem of Hayek, the coordination problem of von Mises, which is that's actually quite central. Like, it doesn't matter how smart you are. If you don't work at the McDonald's, you don't know what they need. If you don't look at the physical pipe, you don't know how to fix the physical pipe that's leaking under your house. You have to be there. So evaluation would seem to help avoid some of the Hayekian and von Mises concerns. So those are some thoughts.
I think the very need to ask a question like, is the recognition of beauty self-evident, or does it have to be trained into existence, sketches out the shape of the thought structure that's needed for an answer. Right. And I think the simplest way to put them together is something like, it might be self-evident at its minimal level, but you could then still develop increased capacity in that function. Right. So that maybe in a like Whiteheadian sense, the recognition of beauty as a form of value is built into the very metaphysics of reality, and that every being of every kind has some form of recognition of beauty, but the ability to recognize it with depth, with nuance, with actionability, both in a more general universal sense and in a particular contextual sense, that's something we can train up. Right, at the most, let's say in the crudest possible sense, your chemical capacity to fire up the molecules that allow you to feel the beauty response, those are contingent particular material circumstances. We're not equally capable of producing those. We need certain nutrients in us. We need certain practices. We have to get better at the ability to flood our systems with those chemicals in order to find the greater ranges and intensities of the beauty experience. Likewise, our intellect has to come into play in trying to critique where our response to beauty is overly embedded in one particular pattern and where it might be generalizable across patterns. So we could say that there's something like a basic capacity, which is also like a basic module or talent that we have, which can then be increased along various vectors. And that increase, whether we call it level-like or not, involves an increasing sophistication and intensity and precision. And part of that increase of sophistication would be the ability to simultaneously generalize and contextually locate beauty or any other kind of value that we're discussing.
I think it's an excellent answer. It does seem to me that if there is not some baseline sense of the, dare I say, mystery, capital M mystery, then there is no way the scale problem's off the table, because it can't, it's kind of done, right? So the conversation's over. But I do think there's reason to think there is a baseline. One could argue that baseline is the lack of psychoanalysis, that everyone has a sense that something is off, that something is not right. And what's interesting is, if the lack is indeed something that all humans have at a base, then that lack also does seem to coordinate or be the openness of these experiences of beauty, because the beauty is something more, right? And it's not merely pretty. And so there's this kind of sense of something that is external from you, but not objectable. And let me explain that. I was speaking the other day with Tyler, and then Boothby was talking about Das Ding and Lacan. And a way I understand Das Ding, because you have the real lack and Das Ding and Lacan, which are all to me, they're all very similar, but also distinct, maybe like persons of the Trinity I was kind of playing with, where they're distinct, but they're all the same at the same time. Das Ding seems to be the external subjectivity that you cannot objectify. What I mean by that is when I look at a bookcase, I can say that's a bookcase. I can turn it into an object. I, as a subject, have subjectivity. Das Ding is when you experience another person that you know contains a subjectivity that you can't reduce to an object, and yet you know is there external from your own subjectivity. And so lack is your own subject-to-subject experience of, having an incompleteness. The real, as Cadell will talk about, is when you're trying to go to the airport and your desires are thwarted because the taxi is late. So the objective world thwarts your symbolic understanding. So lack is where you try to understand yourself and you can't make a symbolic system to understand yourself. It's always a strange loop, as Hofstadter will put it. The real is when the world screws you because the taxi is late. So there's something you thought you could plan through and get around and you can't. So you're thwarted. And Das Ding seems to be the encounter of something that you cannot put into symbolic structure that is like your subjectivity, but beyond it. It's not within the range of what you can put in subjective experience. So it's the subjective in the objective world, per se, or the object world. Well, a lot of theologies kind of suggest is not only is the Das Ding in people, but it's also lurking in reality. There are glimmers of beauty, glimmers of mystery. There are these moments when some sort of archetypal thing explodes forth and human beings are just going about their business and suddenly have a transcendent experience. You could view psychedelics as having some sort of revelation of the Das Ding, because it turns out there was this whole possible experience of reality in front of you all the time, but until you took the right psychedelic to condition your brain in a different material way, you couldn't open up to all of those things. And actually, it turns out the capacity was inside you all along if it met the right chemical or the right whatever. Wow, turns out the reality is a giant capital M mystery all of a sudden. All of that would then be kind of movements up the scale of getting better at this kind of beauty, or the three transcendents, or different things, right? And so the question becomes, does everyone have a baseline experience of the mystery or beauty? I think so, because it definitely seems to be the case that the psychoanalysis people are not wrong, right? And in fact, if we follow someone like Durkheim or people like Freud, who basically says that psychoanalysis is needed as you move from a third world nation to a first world nation. First world nations have the most depression, suicide, makes me think of Walker Percy's opening essay in Message to the Bottle. It's like, it's very strange. Well, it's almost like what ends up happening is when you have to get water every day to survive, there's an external reality that the beauty is found in the accomplishment of the task, the kind of truth and the goodness is found in these things. But as the external world is taken care of, then you don't necessarily have the world give to you the experiences of good, true, and beautiful. You have to cultivate them from yourselves. And then what you experience instead tends to be the lack then, right? Because that's what you tend to experience, because the world isn't doing these things and you haven't trained yourself to do these things. So I do wonder if actually the base minimum experience of beauty that tends to come out in simply survival in a third world nation is not necessarily provided so readily in a first world nation. And so what the baseline experience is actually lack, but it's of the same Das Ding. It's of the same sort of thing that cannot be symbolized, that cannot be captured in the full scope of the world. So maybe a way to put it is like this. Does everyone on planet Earth have a sense of a Das Ding? A sense of something that they can't fully capture in their map? A sense of territory that's not part of their map? Does everyone have that sense of something that is beyond the range of what they can fully understand, that is beyond them? If so, then it would seem it would be possible to perhaps start pursuing the question of scale, because then there is something that even the average person or the average baseline can resonate with, that can then be worked on or thought about or trained. I think this is probably the case, because even like scientists like Richard Dawkins talk about the enchantment of reality. You have popular Christian writers talking about the sacred romance. John Edmund, I can't think of his name. You have Lewis talking about the weight of glory. You have the mystery. You have the psychedelics. There is seemingly a very large collective sense of a something more, of a mystery that can be worked up. So do we accept that premise that the average person has a baseline in the same way that the average person has a baseline feeling that they need to eat? You don't have to teach people that they need to eat. They just know, but then they can be better chefs or they can be more nutritious or not. Does everyone likewise have a kind of sense of a capital M mystery? Do we think that's true?
Yes, that's my sense of things. I'm resonant with Nietzschean formulations, which is that at the most basic level of reality that's thinkable, we have to imagine a process that's transforming itself, that's overcoming itself, which implies something like value, something like polarization. It's in a struggle between being confined at the level of value experience it has or trying to increase its value experience. That's very metaphysical, but we see it played out in very concrete ways over evolutionary history. If we take the frame that we're evolving beings constantly adapting and trying to be fitted to particular niches in the world, that fittedness is always going to be variable. Even if you were to perfectly fit your personal ecological situational niche, the fact that you're in a system that's always changing means in the next moment you're going to be imperfectly fitted. So insofar as we are evolved to be creatures constantly trying to navigate toward best fit, we have to, by our very nature, be encountering something that's superior and something that's inferior relative to a structure of reality that falls outside of our mapping.
I think it's a good answer. I think the point of political, the fact that there's political change or revolution also speaks to it. All right. So given all of the case studies, if you will, that are put forth, there is reason to think that the average person, by definition, desires to navigate a best fit. All right. That being the case, do you agree with the point I guess I'm making? Because like to me, this point has to be made to even consider the question of scale. Because if this is not the case, there's nothing you can scale without it being totalitarian, forcing people. Does that follow, you think?
Sure.
All right. So if we think that people navigate best fit, then the question is how to navigate people toward best fit without being totalitarian. Well, that would require evaluation for everyone in their emergence, in their individual particular circumstance, to be able to evaluate best fit, of which there is reason to think they will do because everyone has an inherent sense of a need to best fit. Do we think that follows?
Yes, we think that follows. For individuals, that's driven by a lot of instincts and emotionally laden sensitivity that we're built with. When it comes to systems, we don't get that immediate subjective feedback, which makes it a much murkier zone. So one of the things we need to do in order to scale is to make something equivalent to that sensitivity that organisms have operating inside the computational, algorithmic, and legal, mechanical systems that we're setting up around us.
That's an excellent, but so are we saying that we need a self-evaluating system or a system that is capable of evaluating itself?
Yes, because even a perfectly adapted system could be off course in the next moment, given the fact that it's nested in a constantly changing universe.
Excellent. My understanding is people kind of view democracy, capitalism, competition as having these functions of being a self-evaluating and self-correcting system. Why do we think that it has failed to do so or is maybe not doing so optimally? Is it precisely because of the scale of capitalism that has led to it failing to self-evaluate? Is it precisely the scaling of democracy in a centralized way that has led to a failure of these self-evaluations, or were they never self-evaluating?
I think they have the ability to be much more self-evaluating and self-organizing than they have been. And there are strong incentives for individuals, groups, or families historically to prevent that self-organizing from fully manifesting itself. Right. So we have a democracy, but we have an extremely limited form of democracy. Right. The idea that you give your one vote every 4 years for one of two parties, and then the one with the largest number wins, even if it's disliked by the majority of the population, and we call that representing the will of the people, that's an extremely low form of collective decision making. Right. We know a lot more about how we could do that. There are all kinds of different voting reforms. There are all kinds of different mechanisms for collating information, outputting collective decisions. The democratic principle could function much more powerfully, but it's actually to the advantage of entrenched interests to prevent that from occurring. Similarly with capitalism, right? If capitalism was, say, this is just a speculative scenario,
Sure.
sourcing numbers from a greater number of dimensions of reality, then it could make a much more interesting self-organizing set of decisions. If all kinds of work were rewarded with social credits of some kind, then maybe it could self-organize. But we have a legally enshrined system that's incentivized by certain types of organizations to make sure that the ways we attribute numerical value to objects and activities remains extremely limited. It's very convenient for McDonald's to be able to sell a $1 cheeseburger rather than a $40 cheeseburger. And the way it does that is by not counting a huge number of labor events as being rewarded with cash. So we don't know how smart and how self-correcting capitalism could be if it was actually counting all the things. But it's to someone's interest to not count all the things. So right now, we have inherited drives and inherited social systems, inherited family dynamics, ranges of pathologies, sociopaths, narcissists, and different kinds of cultural pathologies as well, which are preventing these systems, which have done a lot of interesting self-correcting material, from being better than they currently are.
Excellent. Makes me think as well. I know Miss Benita Roy, who I like very much, talks about self-organization and the idea that we see evidence of self-organization in society. She also makes that wonderful point where she asks all the CEOs of companies, do you really, hey, you say you like democracy, but let's make your business a democracy. No, we don't want to do that. And so there's this interesting way in which maybe in a kind of, psychoanalytical way, we say we like democracy, but we actually don't, because if we literally had to vote for every issue, we would be responsible, constantly having existential anxiety. We much rather say vote for a person that we don't know what they're going to do. So then if they do something we don't like, we can push them away and say, well, I didn't know they were going to do that. It's not my fault. And so actually there's a funny way in which the current democratic system, which is a democratic Republican system, more so representation in America, is actually a kind of psychotechnology to avoid democracy and participation, which also follows if we don't know how to evaluate, because democracy would make us make choices that we don't even know how to make. And then if they blow up in our face, we don't know what to do, with then having to be forced to acknowledge we don't know how to make good choices and evaluate. And we rather live in plausible deniability that we are capable of these things. I think also what you're saying on capitalism is very good as well. I think for me, Milton Friedman is always attacked, where he says famously a corporation should only be concerned about generating profits, right? That's the only, for the shareholders, you should only maximize equity for shareholders. There is a comma that says within the legal and moral bounds of the society. That, of course, gets dropped. But you see, that's actually, for me, a really big deal, because that would require people to evaluate outside the metric of profit. And if they cannot do that, then people will think they're within the legal and moral bounds, like Milton Friedman is talking about, but actually they will not be. The moment you have a caveat, you have the evaluation problem that you're describing. I think also the problem is, like you're getting at, is we confuse metrics with evaluation. We say, oh, like if you have a metric where you say this business is successful because it increases profit, well, that's one metric. What I understand, like for me, evaluation is a plethora of metrics that you're interrelating and thinking together, right? That sucks. Why don't we just have the metric of profit, and then we can like quantify? Because the moment you talk about a network of metrics, you're also going to be talking about not just quantification, but qualification, the ways that they increase the quality of one another. And how do we even evaluate and judge quality? We haven't been trained to do that. All we know are numbers, right? So there's also an issue where capitalism, one could say, and this may be a part of scale, like the larger the scale, the more it justifies itself according to single or limited metrics that then seem to be evidence of success, where maybe they're only success because they block out the lack of payment to the workers elsewhere, or the negative consequences to the environment, and so on and so forth. So I would understand a critique of capitalism, say in terms of the meta crisis, to be one of capitalism having better evaluation, as opposed to outsourcing everything to metrics. So this would seem to suggest that one of the reasons why these supposed self-correcting systems have turned into something not self-correcting is an outsourcing of evaluation to metrics, or running from existential anxiety by having the representative do the decision making for us, that then we can have plausible deniability for our choice if they turn out not to be what we think. Do we think that having a society of evaluation, which seems necessary for self-organization, because if Bonita Roy is correct that self-organization, that would seem to require a clear goal that people agree is valuable. Then they can coordinate themselves without direct one-on-one power, right? Like if 50 people say this is beautiful, we ought to honor it. Nobody has to convince one another or use power. Everyone just kind of emergently goes about it. And I think that when Brendan was talking about Dante and beauty, Dante in the Paradiso has so many dancing images, dancing around beauty. I associate beauty as a core of self-organization, right? So if everyone thinks this is true, then there's self-organization to defend it. Now, classically, as Brendan brought up, all three have to go together, right? Like if you have beauty without truth, it's seduction. If you have truth without goodness, it's just hard, mindless fact. But assuming you have all three together, that can create a good, or dare I say beneficial, self-organization, but that would require everyone to be able to evaluate that all three of those are present, not just one, and to self-organize themselves accordingly. So that to me would suggest that evaluation and self-organization as such go together. And one of the problems that have happened in these other self-organizing systems is a movement to a metric as opposed to a structure of evaluation.
I think there are a lot of problems around the self-sabotage of systems by insufficient integration of their subsystems. And one of the places you see that played out is by the creation of single insufficient metrics. Now, to some degree, in order to have a wiser system, whether it's external or whether it's our perception of ourselves, we have to be more pluralistic, more multifarious. We have to be thinking in terms of multiple intelligences. It's not enough to reason. You also have to feel. You also have to be able to act. You also have to have creativity, all those things. You can do that externally as well. We could have a multiple metric system. When it comes to instantiating action, you have to do something like the mythical collapse of the waveform. You have to turn it into something like a single metric in order to take action. The question is, how many different variables are being taken into account in that single metric, and how good a job is the process of combining being undertaken? Right, so that there's this old discussion in human beings relative to the market, which is there's some things that are really valuable to us that you just can't put a price on. And that's absolutely understandable. And to some degree, spiritually and morally, we have to be able to draw that line. But at the same time, there's a lot of things we say that about that actually should be incorporated into the market so that the market could be smarter. This whole field of ecological economics says the finite resources of the planet need to be taken into account in the negotiation of prices. Otherwise, the prices will just move away from those actual resources. So this is the famous example is if a tree costs 1,000 credits standing and you can sell it for 500 credits, then you've lost 500 credits by cutting it down. But if it's 0 credits when standing and you sell for 500, you've made 500. In both cases, there's a single metric, but in one case, the metric takes the value of the living tree into account. So there's a lot of ways to tweak that so that you get a metric that actually combines across multiple different forms of evaluation in the same way that the individual has to take specific instantiated action, but that action seems to be wiser when it combines information from multiple evaluation processes and multiple internal intelligence systems.
Excellent. So a quick question. Would we say that evaluation is inherently plural and therefore relational, while metrics are inherently singular and therefore not relational?
I think that's a good heuristic. If we dove into that deeply, we might contest it a little bit. But I think in order to understand what's going on, in order to evaluate it properly, you have to do that across a spectrum of viable methods of interpretation. And in order to take action, you have to converge those into some singular phenomenon.
Sure, absolutely.
Although it's never going to be perfect, right? We're
Sure.
talking about a wide end of the one-many scale and a narrower end of the one-many scale.
Of course, excellent. But there's a sense where evaluation is the ability to think of a multitude of metrics. So this is the funny thing. It seems like evaluation entails metrics, but metrics don't necessarily entail evaluation. And that always seems to be what you're dealing with, a negation sublation, to use Hegel. It's like what you're not leaving the thing behind, but you're somehow pulling it into a higher complexity or relationality. Because what you're saying, there is a metric. It is better to be able to breathe clean air than not, right? There is a metric, but the issue is the clean air is thought in line with the value of lumber to keep you warm in the summer, right? But that is also thought with, do we really need a field right here instead of a forest? Maybe a forest would be better. So there's some sort of movement that's going between metrics. It's like, I'll talk about the need to be polytheorists, not monotheorists, right? Like monotheism, like we tend to be tempted by a single theory to explain everything, but really what we need is a multitude of polytheories that are arguably small theories that you're able to interrelate and bring together. So, and indeed, some people may use different language, but it would seem that evaluation is this capacity that is not merely abstract reasoning, nor merely practical. It's in this between space, because I like throwing out terms. Another term I like to talk about is phenomenological pragmatism, which is between pragmatism and just intellectualism. Like you're being pragmatic about the way that experience is relayed to you, which makes me think about nutritious experience, which was such a very useful language that you brought up, nutritious experiences. So if evaluation is a kind of plurality in the sense that there are multiple levels of the stack, and it is also entailing the ability to judge the relation and the weighing of those different levels, which I will note, this again, this point of evaluation has classical roots, so it's not out of nowhere. Then I would also say that evaluation does have connections with the Dosting and the mystery, because the relation by definition cannot be quantified. It is quality. It is something mysterious moving between the different levels of the stack, right? So if we are saying that the Dosting or the mystery, I'll just say capital M mystery, if the capital M mystery is something that humans have a sense of, that arguably they look to itch, they look to address it, then evaluation may also be the practice, because I do think evaluation is a practice, not just a dogma, because you have to do something. Then evaluation may also be the practice that is what scratches the itch of mystery, because it then makes people feel like they're participating in the mystery, or they have agency in the mystery, but that mystery is not reducible to their agency because it is found in the between space of the subject in the world and all of the different values and bringing it together. So it would seem that so far in what we are describing as to put our finger on evaluation, which I really like you bringing in, I think it's very useful. This as a practice seems to address the itch of mystery. It seems to help fight reductionism. And, that's something that's also concerning the liminal web. It seems to entail a relation between many different levels of the society. And because it entails those relations, there is always something that escapes symbolic. You can't symbolize everything because the relation can be moved. One person may relate the economy and the environment and their memories. Another person, their family history. Someone else may do the economy, science, and their family mystery. So there's always this movement. So you can't finally symbolize it, which is like Dosting and Lacan. But you're also not helpless, because that's one of the things that Dosting can be a problem, when you feel helpless before the mystery. And that's when it leads to more nihilism, because you're like, well, I can't do any, I can't, what can I do? It would seem like evaluation is a way to participate in the mystery, have agency in the mystery, while simultaneously helping us fight some of the reductionist mystery, the reductionist tendencies of metrics that we seem to be going at. So then the question is the following: how do people get good at evaluation? How does one spread evaluations? What are the conditions that teach evaluation? I'd be curious how you respond to any of that.
Yeah, it's a really good way to put it, because evaluation is the part of the response to mystery that is potentially scalable, right? There's other potential responses. There's philosophical and sorcerous, magical, yogic, like there's different other ways of dealing with the mystery, but evaluation is one of the most general ones because it applies to every day of everyone's lives and also all the systems in which we find ourselves embedded. So how do we get better at that? I mean, it's a different question for individuals than it is for systems. Clearly, the intervention site for most of these things is the education system and how we perceive that, whether we perceive it as fundamentally community life or the home or the state, whether we perceive it as a knowledge production system or a wisdom production system. The simplest possible thing is to, like any other skill, give people more opportunities to practice it. Right? I can't think of a single instance in my elementary or high school years where I was ever seriously asked to ponder and evaluate something meaningful, let alone every week or every day, or what it would take to develop those kinds of skills. So the notion that there's a distribution of autonomy of evaluation to students and that they are entrusted with the attempt to do that under the framework that that attempt will itself make them better, I think that's important. You have to be able to critique your own biases in order to determine whether or not your evaluation process is being distorted by something. If there are ranges of affect or types of people or types of domains of knowledge that you just personally refuse to allow into your evaluation process, then it will be skewed. I think from the sort of religious training perspective, one thing that's important is the ability to have the physiological experience, which is mental, emotional, and somatic, of what the best fit evaluation outcome is, right? They would traditionally have used very hyperbolic terms like 100% true, totally true, unsurpassable, these sorts of things. They try to give you the feel. From my framework, those are not objectively justified. You don't need to totalize, but you can still have maximal. What is it like to encounter maximal positive evaluation of something? This is something a lot of the Eastern saints and the Western philosophers were working on. It's even deep in Descartes. I would argue that his notion of God that he thinks is true, despite the conditions of universal doubt, is really a proposal that the maximum possibility of verification is available to you under all cognitive conditions. But nonetheless, if you can't know what it's like to give that Nietzschean almost total yes, to feel like, oh, that is the best possible match, then you have a very hard time adjudicating in your decision-making process how close or how far away you are from that particular experience. So to have organisms that are capable of the richness of that positivity, that sense of intense confirmation, I think that's important to the process. But also then you've got to take off the other distorting systematic frames, right? If there's a lot of top-down social pressure or peer pressure or status needs being met within the educational institution or the home, those things are all going to impinge upon the evaluation process, right? If you ask people in Scientology how great they think Scientology is, you're going to get a very positive answer that's not really based on them carefully evaluating the process. It's based on defaulting to the social dynamics they're embedded in. So a lot of this is about removing the things that skew evaluation and also giving people a lot of opportunities to practice evaluating.
Excellent. It would seem, so there's a few things that come to mind. This does seem to have something to do with education. And it is very interesting that education does seem to reflect the information technology of the day. So for example, in an oral tradition, an educated person is someone who's memorized the Torah and they can just speak it to you, right? There's a lot of memorization is big. In a written culture, that's not so valued because if you can just read it, why do you need that? And you get in a William Ong more of an emphasis on scientific reasoning. He thinks that we weren't even capable of thinking scientifically until writing because we weren't able to be systematic in our sort of thinking, nor could we be creative, right? So what constitutes being educated after the invention of writing is different. And then we follow Neil Postman and the disappearance of childhood. He basically says that an adult today is someone who can read. So we even define what constitutes maturing as being good at the information technology. And then also education before the internet would seem to be in the business of teaching you facts because you don't know what facts you need to know and where do you even access the information. You need a teacher to guide you. Well, now under the internet, where all facts are basically available, if you don't know when the American Revolution was, you could just pull out your smartphone. It's more accessible to facts. It would seem that education that is in the business of making facts available to you or in the business of memorization is inadequate for the information technology of the day, which tends to always define what is education and what it is to be educated. And given the David Reef stuff we were saying earlier, it would seem that being educated today has a lot to do with the ability to evaluate, as opposed to just follow a metric. Because if we take that metric evaluation distinction, it does seem like metric is inherently totalitarian almost. Like, this is the metric and you must follow it. Oh, and by the way, you don't need to think, because look, this made more money than this. There's nothing to think about. The metric just gives it to you. Whereas evaluation brings forth a necessary involvement of the subject, which then educationally is interesting, because to evaluate, you're going to have to overcome anxiety, your own nervousness about evaluating, your own nervousness about saying this is good versus bad, but then you also have the intellectual capital to determine the good from the bad. So there is something about education here. And something else I wanted to note is there's always a problem. Like, it is quite clear that the kind of subject, the child, as we mentioned at the beginning, can be produced by someone joining the right community, being part of the right organization, engaging in the right practices. But there's always the problem that that's probably a minority of people, right? It's not going to be the majority of people who are going to go up to Vermont and be part of some of the Metamodern summits or different things. Maybe everyone should, but most people will not. In the same way that, say, in church, most people are not going to read Aquinas or Augustine, nor are they even going to put basic teachings of maybe Jesus into place because my neighbor sucks. Maybe my entire life is dedicated to just learning to visit my neighbor because it's so difficult, right? Let alone thinking about the intricacies of the Trinity or something like that, right? So there's always that. And one of the ways I think about it is you can always, at scale, if you have a community, the differences of the community of a small group can be verbally negotiated. Like, if there's 20 people, you can verbally negotiate, and you can actually hold the community together simply by negotiation and talking, right? The problem becomes a scale when literally you're part of a group with people that you've never met. And so it's not possible to negotiate with them, right? So that's when you need to systemize. You create a system. The virtue of a system is that it works even for people who don't like it, who aren't involved with it. They don't have to participate. It still works for them, like capitalism. You don't have to have ever read Adam Smith to be part of capitalism. It just works without the human element. Whereas a low-scale community only works because of the human element. The virtue of a low-scale community is that it's inherently human element. It has a human element that's part of it. But as you move up the scale, the virtue is that it works without the human element. The vice is also that it works without the human element. It works even if you don't want it to. So the very virtue of the system that deals with the problem of difference is precisely the vice of smashing out difference and removing the human element. So the question is, as we talk about scale, how to maintain the human element that's found in small community at scale with everyone. But of course, you constantly run into the problem of totalitarianism or forcing something upon people they do not want. It makes me think of the techno-social conversation that Owen and Jim Rudd and Frege were having, where, for Game B, they say, well, everyone in Game B can agree that we need to take care of the environment, right? That the world is sustainable. Well, we talked about this last time, but the problem is people don't agree on what is sustainable. Well, wait a minute. What does that mean? The ability to evaluate. And evaluation does also seem to be something that, of everything we've discussed, it seems to be scalable without being totalitarian. But then, of course, the question is, how do you teach it? And I think we can also agree, given the information technology of the net, that having education focus on evaluation at the expense of previous things that are taught is not actually foolish, because the things that were previously taught are actually provided by the information technology or not so necessary. And one could argue that evaluation is basically the only way to survive infinite information. Like, if you're constantly being overwhelmed by facts and information in the net, then evaluation is a matter of life and death. And then if you're going to have deep fakes or AI controlling you, then the ability to engage in ontological self-defense, to reference Daniel Frege, is everything. Well, that would seem to be the skill of evaluation. I would also wonder if evaluation, I've been playing with this term recently, I do wonder if evaluation also has qualitative changes in the person, not merely quantity or quality, but actually your very experience of reality changes qualitatively. That seems to also be part of what's going on, because if we're talking about deeper experiences of the mystery beyond the baseline, one of the reasons that seems to be appealing to people is because it has qualitative changes on them. Their very way of qualitatively experiencing reality transforms, and the ability to evaluate transforms the way the world is towards you. In a qualitative, you don't see trees just as lumbers, you see them as part of a dance, if you will, of nature, or maybe the Charles Taylor enchantment that he talks about in The Secular Age and different things. So the next thing that comes to mind, because I'm always wondering if you teach intrinsic motivation first, but because it's kind of funny, like, do people need to be intrinsically motivated to evaluate, or will evaluation create intrinsic motivation because they have a qualitative transformation? Well, it would seem that once people learn that they can literally change the world, in a sense, to themselves through a qualitative transformation, that may intrinsically motivate them to do it more and more, because the whole world suddenly discloses itself as a place that can be qualitatively transformed. And so people would want to entertain that mystery more so, or that ability. So I'd be curious on, do we think that teaching about, this would be the question, do we think teaching evaluation inherently creates motivation to evaluate more? Or do you have to teach motivation to evaluate separate from teaching evaluation? Because it could be the case that you teach people how to evaluate, but they're not motivated to evaluate. Or is it the case that what evaluation does motivates you to evaluate more, ergo to more so participate in reality, to qualitatively transform the world in a manner that had systems level result? Because you could argue, if people are so intrinsically motivated, they're probably not going to consume the same way. They're probably not going to participate in the economy the same way. They're probably going to be different in their relationships. So evaluation could have an emergent impact on a broader scale, even, and then maybe that leads to what Osho is saying, where the systems melt away, because then people are kind of changing on that level. So do we think evaluation creates, I'll be curious how you respond to any of that, do we think evaluation creates motivation to evaluate, or that motivation and evaluation have to be taught separately? Because if they have to be taught separately, that would be a different way of doing education than if you simply have to teach evaluation, which leads to motivation.
In some ways, it depends on who you're starting with, right? Different children coming into a school system are going to be in different states of ability to access intrinsic motivation than others. So the school system has to presume that difference, but also it has to be ready to take into account people that aren't very good at that, right? I think there's a constructive feedback loop between evaluation and intrinsic motivation, but in order to get the ball rolling under its own momentum, you may have to exert some additional force up front. So if you create an educational system or even a social system that encourages and to some degree enforces, or at least sets a framework whereby we should be doing these more advanced evaluation processes, that makes it more likely for people to engage them and to discover their capacity to generate intrinsic motivation. I think there is a wide range of qualitative outcomes that are very positive. That you can sort of get high off good motivation, that you can find yourself resculpted by that. I think this is the history of the sage, of the wisdom character. They're not just undertaking wise action in a moment, they're participating in a life pattern whereby they grow toward being one of the wise people. And the idea behind that is there's something pleasurable about being wise. There's some qualitative change in your ability to appreciate and feel that you are a peer to the world. And I think a large part of this is that it's intrinsically pleasurable to integrate multiple internal intelligence systems within individuals. Right, you get a generalized, like, gestalt effect of coherence within yourself that has historically been called something like being or soul or something like that. But to have those things reinforcing each other, you feel like you're more together than you were. And to feel more together is an intrinsically positive experience, but you may need some help getting there from a situation which you're in another kind of a feedback loop.
That's excellent. So I don't have to teach you to not want to be hungry. You don't want to be hungry. And there is an intrinsic joy in eating food in that circumstance. If there is a mystery drive, I guess we could say from earlier, which I think there's reason to think, dusting and all of that, then human beings naturally have a lack that then feeling you have a better hold of, even if you can never solve it away, there is a feeling that is inherently pleasurable of if you are more integrated in light of that lack, and actually learn to use that lack as something that makes you open more so to the mystery of the world. If people have that drive, which I think there is reason to think, then the name of the game is how to make them keep that drive, not to give it to them. They already have it. So how do they keep it? And how do they feel that they can do something about it? Because let's say, for example, you have a drive to eat, but you have no access to food. Well, then it's a torture to you, right? Because you feel hungry and there's nothing you can do. So it becomes a torture. So likewise, if people have a kind of drive for mystery and they're led to a place where they feel they can do nothing about it, that could be leading into, the meaning crisis, right? That they have this drive, they didn't ask for it, but it's not being met. And the way it gets met is with this integration, harmony, or whatever that's being described, which I think you're exactly right, that it is intrinsically pleasurable to do it. It goes to what concerns me about Plato in the allegory of the cave. The guy leaves the cave because he's dragged out. A guy comes to everyone, he doesn't just get up and leave. He has to be dragged out, right? Well, this is a huge problem, because that means education for Plato has to be kind of basically totalitarian. You have to force people out. But so the question I always ask with the allegory of the cave is it possible for someone to leave the cave on their own with no one ever dragging them out? Can they realize they're in a cave, that they are a prisoner, and that they need to leave, right? If mystery is a drive, then the answer is it's possible. Then we're not you're not doomed per se, because actually if mystery is not a drive, following Plato, the only answer is totalitarianism, something that's forceful. I think there is reason to think, not just speculation, but based on everything we're describing, there is reason to think that it is possible for someone to leave the cave on their own. Now, that would mean that they realize they can do that, not gain it. The teacher in education then is not giving something, nor are they forcing you out. They're making you realize something. And that would seem to be evaluation. So if evaluation is precisely what can be taught that leads to someone feeling more integrated and therefore more likely to leave the cave on their own, then teaching evaluation would take care of the motivation problem. Now, I do agree it's going to be different ways of doing the education because people come in with different drive levels. But if there is a shared baseline of mystery, then that means there's a shared baseline of motivation that regardless the customization that has to be done for each individual, overall, the goal would be evaluation to lead to the integration. So then there are just different ways of teaching evaluation or doing the evaluation lesson. So then the question would be the following. What teaches evaluation? What is it that makes someone get better at it or worse at it that then leads them to being better at this integration? Now, I'll throw in my 2 cents, although I'll let you, because I do think there might be actually historical reason to think that it's one thing versus the other, based on the work of Dietrich McCloskey on the Great Enrichment, the work of James Hunter on his book To Change the World, and then also like the William Ong in the information technology. And then it would also get us into Jonathan Rauch's Kindly Inquisitors. But let me just ask you about the framing of all that. Because then what we're saying is that the scaling problem is a matter of figuring out and focusing on, because you could focus on anything, right? You could focus on the spread of art, the spread of motivation, the spread of money, the spread of capital. We have to choose, like the scaling problem is a matter of choosing the thing that you focus on that somehow navigates all of these ditches and things, right? And so far, it seems to be that there is reason to think that figuring out how to train evaluation through the education system, then arguably technology teaches as well. So is there a way for technology to teach evaluation would perhaps lead to a spreading of this thing that we think needs to be spread so people cannot be destroyed in the ontological design war that Daniel Frege is talking about, so that the meta crisis doesn't manifest in the Nash equilibrium that concerns Smackenberg, so that the meaning crisis is addressed? Do we agree with the framing? Are there problems with the framing, et cetera, so forth?
I think the framing is good. I think it's sound. I think the things that are necessary, here's three things that are coming up in the front of my mind about what's necessary in order to train evaluation. One is good teachers, by which I mean people who engage you and people who stand as exemplars, right? Because you might not have to drag people out of that cave. If you show them that you went out of the cave and it seems to be working out great, and you're willing to talk to them about it and engage their intrinsic drive toward that mystery themselves. Otherwise, a small percentage of people will go for it anyway, but most of the people require observing that other people have done it and it worked out. So that's one. I think another one is health, and I mean health specifically in the sense of not having our systems sabotage each other, right? We might say that I have this value of mystery, I have an intrinsic drive toward it, but also I have some weird self-esteem issue which tells me that I shouldn't have the things I want, and I should not enjoy the things that I enjoy, stuff like that, right? That's psychological health. I think there's physiological and emotional roots of that as well. But if your system is interfering with its own ability to function, then it won't be able to manifest its functions. And then the third thing I think is, this is to me the really important question: what are the sub-skills necessary to do evaluation, right? Like swimming requires you to be able to go in the water and tip your head and breathe and move your arms. There's a lot of sub-skills involved. And I think the sub-skills that are really particularly necessary are sort of metacognitive self-inspection, the ability to persist through cognitive dissonance and interior struggle, and the ability to sort of intentionally hold yourself in processes until they're completed, rather than saying, like, if I'm going to evaluate something, if I stop the process before the evaluation is complete, nothing is really obtained. So I have to be able to metacognitively monitor and hold myself to things. And those are essential, right? Intentionality and metacognitive self-critique, and the awareness that is partly learned from the people around you, that you do have different internal systems of evaluation. Because if everybody talks to you like you are already one totally complete unit, then it seems to you like you're using a single metric, as opposed to talking to you like that you consist of parts, and that you should actually check those parts as part of your evaluation mechanism. So there's a certain model of the self that has to be put forward to people as part of training the evaluation process.
Magnificent. And indeed, I don't mean to suggest the framing is some sort of marital commitment that has to be stuck with forever. There's always an issue with the problem of scale is always going to require some focus or framing, because you can't scale everything. But of course, that by definition runs the risk of reductionism or cutting things out that you don't want to cut out. So there's always a tension here where you have to frame in a manner that is solid but open. A reason why evaluation seems nice is because it can address the concerns of Friedrich Hayek, but also not just lead to anarchism or something like that, as in all the other things we spoke about. So here's another question. Do we think that the person who is capable of the things that you described, the evaluator, let's call them the evaluator, is that person someone for when the average person encounters them, they say, I want to be like that? And that would speak to the beauty that Brendan is speaking about, how beauty is a thing that attracts you, and then not only attracts you, but changes you in the attraction. Beauty also works on your loves. What you see is beautiful works on what you love. And I think James K.A. Smith is very good on this, where he says what you are what you love, because your love works on your habits, and your habits work on your character. So beauty works on love, which works on habits, which works on character. So if the evaluator is inherently attractive, then that could be a spread function right there. So the question is the following. Do we think that when people encounter an evaluator, they are attracted to be like that evaluator because of the baseline mystery, like we said at the beginning, that everyone has? Or must they be conditioned to it? And I think we've established they have the baseline, but does that baseline make the evaluator inherently attractive?
it doesn't magically automatically work in all cases, but I think there is a tendency there. Just as there's a tendency to find yourself more attractive as you become more capable of better evaluation, there's a tendency to find other people who are good at that more attractive as well. And some of that's contextual, like working at McDonald's. You may have to really get to know a person before you can detect that about them, or they might not be the kind of person who demonstrates that for your type of processing. Or it might be that they are good at it in such a way or to such a degree that you would require a greater evaluation capacity in order to evaluate that property. So there's a lot of range there, but I think it's not for no reason that the philosophical sages and the bodhisattvas and the Christs and the saints are depicted as having some kind of aura of attraction to the general population, which overrides the fact that they might seem to be somewhat useless to the power system that exists. We go, in addition to the fact that they're not behaving like the rest of us, they nonetheless have something that seems good. And as we get to know them better, that stands out with increased clarity, because they're demonstrating a skill set that we can all connect to and which we instinctively understand will generalize our capacity to move in the world in a way that integrates across greater numbers of values.
Excellent. Does this mean that exposure to evaluators is part of the way to deal with the spreading of the skill of evaluation?
Yes, and that's one of the basic principles in the East, right? Satsang, to be in good company. Now, it has to be carefully managed, right? Someone could be a very good evaluator and the social circumstance set up around them might be despotic, right? Or and any number of subtle problems less than despotism, right? So we have to take the interpersonal and social dynamics on their own terms, but generally speaking, to be in friendship with the lovers of wisdom is an anciently prescribed method of becoming a better evaluator.
Excellent, because there is the problem of the Hitler attraction, right? Like everyone is attracted, so the bad guru and different things. But there is something that seems to be the case that the evaluator attracts. So there's something about the problem of spread there, where the evaluator naturally has a spreading function in being an evaluator. The question would be, can education teach people that an evaluator is someone who can evaluate multi-layer relationally all three of the infinities, not just one? Therefore, when you encountered Hitler, you would say, oh, that's not an evaluator, because they actually are not evaluating the good, the true, and the beautiful, right? But then, of course, you'd have to be able to do that because obviously all the Nazis thought it was good at the time, so there's this some sort of ability to see through the BS or the appearance. That's part of it. But of course, we have a problem because no one thinks that what they think is good is only what they think is good, as opposed to it actually being good. So one of the skills that would have to be the ability of the evaluator is to actually weigh well. And then there becomes the question of who thinks they don't weigh well. And it would almost seem like part of the skill, because we were talking about sub-skills, part of the sub-skill that people need to be educated to see in the evaluator is almost the meta-evaluation of the evaluator of themselves on their own self-deceptions, cognitive biases. So dare I say that the evaluator, in the same way that you were talking about meta-shamanism, are we talking about a meta-evaluator? And does the meta-evaluator also entail? So not only are you able to evaluate the different metrics relationally in the world, but you also relate to yourself. And maybe that would be the negation sublation of postmodernism, right? Like there's this question of what have we learned from postmodernism? Well, the meta-reference seems to be part of it. So is part of this, so the two questions. One, do we think the meta-evaluator is inherently attractive? The answer, I think, is yes. Not to put words in your mouth, but I think they are. It's almost like they have to be after postmodernism, right? Like you can't go back to modern evaluators because you know they're dictators, right? So the meta-evaluator is attractive. And then the question is, does education train people to recognize meta-evaluation? Does it make meta-evaluations, or does the baseline, because this is actually what I do wonder, does that baseline sense of a mystery also entail a desire to find meta, like someone who's meta, not just an evaluator, but a meta-evaluator in this different sense? I'll let you respond to that because because it seems like the evaluator also is going to entail the ability to evaluate themselves as prone to cognitive biases. And this makes me think of the rational community, Stoa, Peter Lindbergh, and there, Charles Munger, all of these different people.
Yes, I think there is something inherently attractive about the meta evaluator, and I think that that's an attraction that stands out more clearly to good evaluators, particularly when they've gone through the crucible of postmodernism and pluralism and relativism, right? If you haven't encountered the reality of the challenge that those things pose, it might not seem to you important to isolate the meta evaluator and then evaluate them and see how attractive they are. But in the emerging in a metamodern or liminal or integrative or however we want to parse that universe, I think the meta evaluator becomes increasingly attractive. One of the ways that it emerges is sort of spontaneously. I think if you continue to get better at evaluating, the sub-skills that it's using naturally involve some kind of meta critique of your own processes. But I think there are ways to train that. And I think the way you train that is to look at the interpersonal dimension of evaluation. There's your own evaluation process, and then there's how do we get together to make decisions. And with good evaluators co-evaluate something together, it compensates for their individual biases. And if they're trained up from a young age to be good at smarter, more sophisticated forms of group evaluation rather than just show of hands at best, then they can not only learn to viscerally internalize those processes to use them in society, but they learn to internalize the group experience as a kind of virtual self-critique within themselves. They're aware of the perspectives of other good evaluators, and that starts to haunt them as a meta-evaluator, so that the group process of evaluation slowly becomes assimilated into the individual's sense of their own evaluation process. I think that can accelerate the emergence of meta-evaluation.
Excellent. So obviously throughout history, there have been given individuals who have been capable of meta-evaluation, et cetera, so forth. But perhaps postmodernism was the necessary, I know it's dangerous to talk about stages and I always resist it, but historical period that made it now possible for collective meta-evaluation and also more vivid to individuals that meta-evaluation is needed. And I can't help but actually see a lot of the rational community, the mental model stuff, all of that seems to actually be kind of meta-evaluation skills. That actually is a response to postmodernism. There's a kind of postmodernism in that, like self-deception, being concerned about self-deception or confirmation bias is kind of postmodern because there's a reference of your own brain and how it kind of tricks things. So meta-evaluation might be, collective meta-evaluation might be what is now capable now, say 2023, that was not historically possible or as collectively tenable in the past. Again, to be clear, this is not to say that meta-evaluation was not capable for individuals. It obviously was. But if we're talking about the question of scale, it would seem the thing that might be scalable, thanks to, in a way, postmodernism, is this collective meta-evaluation that is collective in the sense of multiple individuals all engaging in and then interrelating in different things. So collective meta-evaluation seems to be part of the discussion, which then has a qualitative transformation on people and perhaps makes it more easy for people to engage in enjoyment of the subconscious. And one of the reasons I've kind of toyed with the word qualitative is because I know that can be captured by the word qualitative, but actually the problem with that is I do actually kind of feel like a third word is needed. And the reason is because I say, how many knives do you have? 2. Okay, that's quantitative. And then you say, is that a good knife? And you'll say, yes, the quality of the knife is good. Qualitative is where you turn the knife around and make it like a stand for your Lego man. It's now a different thing. It is experienced differently. Is that a better quality of the knife? No, because you're arguably not using it for what the knife was made for, but the instant you create a different way to experience the knife, now you can say there's one stand for your Lego man to stand on the top of the knife when it's in the floor, and its quality is great because it's not shaking as the Lego man is on it. So qualitative transformation, which I know is the subjective experience itself, but there's some third change that seems to actually be lacking language. And qualia, and I'm always hesitant to create new language. I think there could be a problem with creating too much new new languages, and then it just keeps going kind of spuriously. But there does seem to also be a necessity for it. And so qualitative, it does seem to be that collective meta evaluation entails qualitative changes because you transform how you experience yourself as a meta entity. You transform how you experience the world because it's a relation of metrics and how they unfold differently. And then qualitatively, collectively, the way you interact with people is different because the nature of the interaction is not merely determining quality or quantity of a given thing, but also the way of conversation itself is different qualitatively. Now, this seems to be what dialogos is that people are talking about, right? This seems to be circling, dialogos. I love voicecraft. This seems to be kind of the voicecraft, which is this talk and then meta-analysis. But then how do we talk about AI doing this kind of collective meta evaluation, where it's not merely discussion about, oh, this is so nifty, we're engaged in collective meta evaluation. It's doing it for the sake of a subject. Because the other thing Cadell has talked about is in psychoanalysis, there's always the danger of transfer dynamics, right? Where you become like the analyst, and how do you avoid that? Or, they were worried about wisdom cults on the Stoa, and how do you avoid kind of the guru? Because that's kind of what we're talking about, right? This kind of risk of Hitler, or there's the evaluator and you want to be like them. One of the reasons why meta evaluation may actually work against this problem of transfer dynamics is because you're not just looking at the guru. You're always meta back on yourself, meta on the conversation as a whole that's irreducible. You can't reduce the dialogos to a single person in it who's then at the risk of being Hitler, because it's a result of the collective engagement of all of the people that make it possible. So there might be something about the collective meta evaluation that also works against transfer dynamics when it is directed toward a subject or a topic, right? Which then makes me think of the psychotechnology that might be circling or dialogos. I particularly like I'm biased because I'm so involved with it. I do see that what Tim Adlin and everyone at Voicecraft is doing as a kind of method of interaction has this reflexivity in meta dimension that, frankly, for me, seems to be what if democracy is not going to be what it has become, that seems to be what's going on, or something like that is needed. There is more to say, but I would be curious on if we think collective meta evaluation in being meta is less likely for transfer dynamics, is less likely for bad gurus, and if that opens up qualitative transformation that seems necessary to scale whatever it is, this mode of people that seems necessary to fight against ontological design, the meta crisis, and the meaning crisis, and all of these different things, which I will note again is scalable without being totalitarian because it manages to meet people in their particularity.
Yeah, these capacities, and I recently wrote this article on Barbie, but it was really just in order to nest a discussion about sincere irony. Because sincere irony has these two facets to it. One is that it could have existed at any point in human history, and you get this sort of meta-reflexive sincerity and irony present in a Socrates. You get it in a Shakespeare, things like that. But there is something about the necessity that makes it large scale that exists now in response to A, problems associated with postmodernism and the degree to which we've experienced those, and B, the information technology we're facing, which puts us constantly in confrontation with vast numbers of arguments, drives, situations, and perspectival contexts. So we need some kind of situation that allows us to A, do the evaluation, and B, not get trapped in what seems like the dangerous sea of things that are competing for our attention, especially now, I think, as we automate attention hacking mechanisms, the counter hacking need will grow. And I think that goes a long way to starting to generate a larger scale distributed community sense of meta reflection on our own processes. And those are absolutely necessary because you have to be able to, let's say, in a context in which evaluators are interacting, there's going to be various kinds of dynamics. So the person that looks more like the guru in any given space, hopefully that person is able to step in and out of that role, make fun of themselves, learn an ethos shared with other people who are in the same position that continues to fulfill their function, but also undermines it as a social status mechanism. And hopefully their life supports and their needs are being met enough that they don't have to try to get all those things met in that educational circumstance. But there's an equal burden on all the rest of the people who are there. They need to be able to get out of this mindset, which human beings have very naturally, that someone on a stage should be looked at and has something important to tell us. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But we tend to look where we think we're supposed to look and listen to who we think we're supposed to listen to. And that has to be collectively critiqued. Why are we thinking this? How are we receiving it? What is our response pattern to it? That has to be a very open conversation. Historically, it's been very rare that people have the metacognitive capacity to have that conversation in large numbers. Today, it seems like it's much more probable because the informational circumstances we're in is forcing that. We either figure out how to do that with a lot of other people, or we get completely absorbed into the information seduction mechanisms. But the danger is going to be what Nietzsche points to with the last man, right? The last man can speak of love and can speak of a star, but they're flat. They're not actually viscerally assimilating this experience. So what we don't want to do is generate a huge number of people who can have a discussion about metacognitive self-reflection and self-critique, and it means nothing. It's not real, it's not authentic, it's not instantiated, it changes none of the outcomes in the world. They just blink and go, yes, we could be wrong in our attention patterns, or something like that.
You said a lot of really good things. So there's a bunch of things that come to mind. Neil Postman, in his book, Teaching as Subversive Act, warns that we need to think of education in terms of, he brings the Marshall McLuhan medium as the message. And he says, what is the medium of education say that being educated is? And he warns that the classroom is structured like a trivia show. The teacher knows all the answers, and whoever can answer the random question fastest with a fact wins. And it's basically, it teaches that intelligence is memory, recollection, that there is someone who has all the answers, and your goal is to be the first one to have the answer. So he says that what happens is the school system indirectly teaches people that being educated is to be good at trivia. And I think that definitely has had quite large, I think that's true. And I think people definitely, that's one of the reasons they're so quick to pull out their phone and look up an answer. They don't want to be exposed for a moment. I'm first, I'll figure out when the American Revolution was. There's a kind of trivia game going on. And it is interesting to think if a lot of our collective troubles is a result of people associating trivia with being educated. A few more things. One of the reasons why I like this idea of meta-evaluation is because evaluation, you can't have a wise guy that knows everything, because even if the person has answers or information, you still have to evaluate your own life. You still have to do something. You can't just sit and listen to the whispers of the Upanishad. You have to go and do something. Now, at the same time, there's a place for the teacher and the person that you respect and are attracted to be like. But since at the end of the day, the emphasis is not on trivia, because if the emphasis is on trivia, why would you ever leave the person who has all the answers? You could always win a trivia if you've got a connection with that guy. Or why would you ever get off the internet? Because the internet's going to make sure you're always right at trivia, right? So then the association of being wise means being good at trivia, which makes you vulnerable to transfer dynamics, bad gurus, to use Mr. Ebert's language, or anxiously using the internet to avoid vulnerability. And then you're going to say, I'm wise because look, I'm doing what the medium of education taught me. But if instead you say, well, no, the name of the game is a meta-evaluation. The nice thing about meta-evaluation versus maybe just evaluation is the meta in of itself entails asking yourself the question, am I just speaking about dancing stars or am I actually a dancing star, right? That has a certain reflective element. Also, if we realize that trivia is not the answer, then you have reason to go live, to go in the places where you can evaluate, as opposed to making sure you're always connected with the guy who knows everything, or that you have the most advanced computer that can get the fastest answer so that you win at trivia. So the first thing that would seem to need to occur is the structure of collective meta-evaluation. Well, let us ask this. Do we think that if there was a spread of meta-evaluation that would also entail collective meta-evaluation, that would have systematic ramifications, that would have ramifications on capitalism, on the government, on science even, or different things, or not. Now, I'll put my cards on the table. I definitely think that when education in the medium teaches that being smart is being good at trivia, then the name of the game in science is to have all the facts, not to do as much technology or going into the unknown, unless you can be guided by mathematics, because then you have the trivia. That's the good. Mathematics and science can be the guru, basically. It has all the answers. Let's stick to it and just follow that. Never mind some of the critiques of Hegel or different things. Politics can have a guru trivia structure. I voted for the right guy. He won. I know the answer. Trump should win. There's a trivia structure, not a critical reflection. And I think also in capitalism, it's like, oh, I know what I should do. I should get a job. Oh, I know the right answer. I know what I'm supposed to do at 30. I'm supposed to start a career. Oh, I know what I'm supposed to do at 60. I'm supposed to retire. There's a kind of I know the answer-ism that education teaches, which is trivia, right? I know the answer. I know the answer. I know the answer. That then I do think trickles down through all these other fields. Now, that may be incorrect, and all rebuttals are more than welcome. But do we think, I guess the question so far is, do we think that a spreading of meta-evaluation would have systematic consequences? Now, we can't predict those systematic consequences, but perhaps there would be reason to think that it would move away from some of the sociopathologies we see today, precisely because so many of the social pathologies are due to an autonomous metric, not having evaluation abilities, therefore falling into manipulation, and so on and so forth.
I think there's a limit to the amount of meta-evaluation capacity you can train up in individuals, because certain ones have more talent than others, and it takes a certain amount of time and right circumstances. It can be intensified, but there'll always be a limitation on that. Likewise, there's a limitation on, but a great ability to expand the sort of the shared ethos of meta-evaluative capacity among individuals. We can increase that, and in the degree to which we increase it, it will have effects on the general operation of the system. But for those effects to really be amplified, they have to be met by an analogous structural move in the formal systems that we're operating through, and maybe even in the devices that we're using. Like, one of the things that strikes me about modernity is the sets of internal capacities we associate with modernity are found throughout phases of history. We find it in Athens, we find it in Mesoamerica, in these little pockets. It doesn't really become a world situation until you've got a printing press, until you've got lenses for looking at the world. It has to lock in across these multiple domains. And I think we can definitely increase the amount of impact that individuals and communities with this capacity have, but it's not really going to lock in until that's met by objective systems that have some similar set of instantiated processes.
That's excellent. For me, I think you're exactly right that there's always going to be different levels of meta-evaluation. To me, in the same way that there's always going to be levels of trivia, some people will be better at trivia than others. If there was a way, so if the medium is the message, the medium teaches if being smart, I guess, is trivia or meta-evaluation. So if you change the medium, that's almost more important than the content. And it's almost like the movement from trivia to meta-evaluation. You know, trivia is going to have its own hierarchy, I guess. Meta-evaluation is going to have its own hierarchy. The movement between them is qualitative. There is a qualitative shift from trivia to meta-evaluation. And although there will always be levels of meta-evaluation, is it possible to spread the qualitative shift, like a phase shift, like a transformation? Can you spread the qualitative shift to more people to think according to a meta-evaluation hierarchy as opposed to a trivia hierarchy? If Neil Postman is correct, that it is the medium of the schoolroom of which teaches one of these, it teaches the trivia hierarchy, then the name of the game would be the changing of the medium of education, to remove the association of being good at trivia with being intelligent or fully human, basically. Because here's the problem, like the average person is taught that everything depends on education, right? Like being the human is a rational animal. We're basically suggesting here that the human is a meta-evaluation animal. Like what we mean by rational kind of changes, right? And likewise, if democracy depends on education, everyone is kind of led to believe that everything hinges upon education as they grow up, at least in America, the majority of people. Like your career is the type. Did you go to college? You get a degree? Well, guess you're screwed. Like everything hinges upon education. And what Neil Postman is putting forth is that the medium, not the content, the medium of education is the problem, because it suggests that being good at trivia is what it means to be successful at life, because that's what it translates to. Like to be successful in terms of system, to be successful in terms of career, to be successful in good of being human, it's a matter of being good at trivia. So if Neil Postman is correct, which I will note he probably is on this, in the same way that Marshall McLuhan seems correct that the very medium of information technology is more pivotal than the content because it transforms how your brain works, which arguably, this is the other thing, there is basically almost empirical evidence of this being the case if you accept studies that, like the Shallows showing how attention spans are changed, if we accept that William Ong shows with the written word that the scientific treatise is invented, that the human brain literally works differently after writing than it did before, this would all suggest that there's actually evidence in history that mediums are what qualitatively transform human beings. And if that is the case, and it does so at scale without really being totalitarian, this is the weird thing. Like, it's not really totalitarian to have access to the internet, even though once the internet exists, people can use it for ontological warfare. They can use it to manipulate. You know, Ivan Illich talks about once the written word is created, it's possible for power to expand because you can write down commands and send it to people you never met. So certainly, there are totalitarian possibilities with writing that were not possible with oral. So there's a hierarchy of good and bad on it. But the point I'm in, and those have to be navigated, like you're saying, with sub-skills and health and different things. But the qualitative change is a matter of a change of the medium. And to me, the movement from trivia to meta-evaluation is a qualitative change. Therefore, the name of the game is the changing of the medium of education, of which then Postman will also know always also entails changes in the content, because the way that the science that you will teach is different if the name of the game is trivia. You're not going to teach science like, you know, Newton tinkering. You're not going to teach science like a tinkerer or, you know, interconnected and all these different things, or going outside and dropping apples. You're going to teach it through tests. You're going to teach it through memorization. So I'm not saying that the medium has no content impact, but the key is that the medium is critical. So the question is the following: what is the medium that education could be changed to reflect in order to lead to a qualitative change from a trivia hierarchy to a meta-evaluation hierarchy? Because that would seem to be the question of the spreading of meta-evaluation that seems to be better addressing, maybe not completely, nobody knows the future, it's totally open, but maybe better prepared for ontological design, meta-crisis, meaning crisis, et cetera, so forth. But I really do think, again, it's interesting that meta-evaluation seems to be an entirely different form of thinking, not merely a different content of thinking.
Yeah, we have to change the medium. I think there's a problem that goes along with the trivia problem, which is emotional and social self-protection and reward. Right? This is the argument made in the growth mindset model. I certainly experienced this in school, is that certain people who by temperament are reasonably good at remembering things and articulating things, even on short periods for tests, those people constantly get patted on the head, and people who don't have that particular skill set get denigrated, right? And the people who are getting patted on the head, it seems like they're being privileged, but they're actually also being undermined because they start to think about school as a way of protecting their special status. They don't want to appear. It's more important. If you get A's all the time, it's really important you don't get a C. If you get C's all the time, you don't care if you get a D. You've got more flexibility. So you're spending your educational time trying to protect your emotional and social status, rather than a system in which you actually learn to experience it as good when you were wrong or in error, because those are your maximum learning opportunities. So that goes along with trivia. They kind of co-create each other, the emotional social aspect and the formal informational aspect. I think there's a lot of information to suggest that learning has to be more community-based wherever that's possible, and that it has to be more oriented. Like the system we know that seems to work best is highly competent tutors for small clusters of children, right? Then there's a lot of interaction, there's a lot of back and forth, there's a lot of their ability to evaluate those particular children. And if you're overwhelmed by children and you're overwhelmed by a bureaucratic system, then you have to outsource your own evaluation capacity to something like a test. It takes over, becomes the surrogate evaluator, which isn't very good. But in order to get that, as we all know, you need to depressurize the school system somehow, because yes, it's a medium for the production of a certain kind of outcome, but it's also embedded in a larger medium, which is the general economic and cultural system that we're using. It would require a different organization of the flows of financing into schools to arrange them such that they could be more community-based, probably more ecologically interactive, but certainly more small group tutor oriented with some kind of technological supplementation for that. And I think Daniel Schmachtenberger has spoken to this as well, the possibility of using AI models of tutors from the past, along with individual human tutors and things like that. I think one of the things we have to keep in mind, though, is the possibility of horizontal and vertical change. Right? The fact that you've changed from one system to another doesn't mean you're necessarily any healthier or any deeper.
Correct.
Right? The question is, if we're using the written print system as our primary method of communication, what do we have to do under those conditions to get smarter, better, healthier, more functional people? If we're going to shift over to a new kind of system, that doesn't guarantee that it's a qualitatively good version of that system. We still have to think about what those dynamics are that moderate that. Maybe you get the shittiest possible version of the new kind of medium. And then the other element of that too is the hidden medium that all of this goes through is the organism. Right? If the organism isn't healthy, if your brain isn't nourished, if you don't have neurocardio coherence, if you're not getting proper exercise, then the medium that all the other mediums are trying to send their educational processes through inhibits the process anyway. So you need reasonably healthy bodies. You need a system in which people are funded enough to be able to have the exchanges whereby the evaluation process can be modeled and used between students and teachers. And it has to be more situated around ecological and communitarian values of some kind. Those are just a couple off the top of my head. That's an entire genre of study.
Well, I think everything you're getting at shows a few things. For me, that all speaks to why there needs to be, you have qualitative, and quantity. Because the issue is, like, even if you have this sort of movement from trivia to meta evaluation, there's still a question of the quality that has to go. But if we only have the categories of quality or quantity, then the notion of this kind of change of the very experience of education is not a category in our thinking. Then, so then if we make the qualitative change, then the question will be, well, how do we do it quality? Which then would be the open question that would get into other things. But if I were to use the language of trivia mindset, because I feel like the trivia mindset is behind, I know language is tricky, but a lot of people talk about game A. So for me, the trivia mindset is the mindset behind game A. So, and for Neil Postman, the trivia mindset is a result of the medium of education. And what's interesting is what Neil Postman, if we think Marx, where Marx puts so much emphasis on the material condition, basically what Postman is saying is the world is made by the medium condition. That's what makes the world, which is a kind of material, but it's also not merely a material because it incubates a certain action of the subject within that medium. So it's in the between space. It's almost like you have mind, material, medium. And medium is a mixture between mind and material, if we go with that language. So for Neil Postman, if you want to change education, you change the medium. You can add all the money you want. You can fund all the schools you want. It won't make a difference. You can have every student in school be an A+ student, high quality, and it won't matter because they all have the trivia mindset. And so game A will not change. And if we buy the premise that game A as it currently stands is auto-cannibalistic, it is eating itself rather through ontological design, meta crisis, whatever, then this will not do. And I know Cadell will talk about game A, B, right, where it's equation of the negation sublation. That seems to be what we're describing. Somehow, even people like Rutt and Jordan Hall, they'll talk about like game B can be nested within and relative to game A and all these different things. So it's a question of relation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the change of the medium, if we agree with the premise that education seems to be somehow at the core of this, and what needs to be incubated is meta-evaluation, because it resists transfer dynamics and all the other stuff we've described, then the question is, what is the medium of education of which would incubate this to lead to a qualitative change in how people think that seems to be the first step necessary for avoiding the auto-cannibalism of game A, if we buy all of that language, which then once we make that qualitative change, we can then ask the questions of how do we do this better? How do we do this work? How do we make more of it? Then we can enter into quality or quantity kind of questions. So the question is the following. What would it look like to change the medium of education? Now, I'll say my different thoughts on it. So, for example, I think colleges have a monopoly on credentials. You basically, in order to get a high-paying job, must go to college. And as a result of a Supreme Court case in America, it's very difficult for companies to do IQ tests or to do what's called employment testing. So they send you to college to do it. The problem is that means your life is determined by what you do in your mid-20s. Let's say you're a 42-year-old single mother who's actually a much better coder than somebody in their 20s. Well, you're screwed because the likelihood of you practically being able to go back to college is very, very low. So the college monopoly on credentials seems to greatly hinder a ability to avoid stage theory, basically, because what ends up happening is you have a stage structure of education that's tied to then employment, that's tied to people's well-being, and people have only so much limited time, and so they tend to connect education with employment. So breaking up the college monopoly on credentials, and the key to this is I know technically it's not that college has a monopoly on all credentials, obviously, but they do on many. Like if you want to get you want to submit your essay to a philosophy journal, do you have a PhD? Oh, you don't? Then you can't even submit. Like there is a radical amount of gatekeeping that is based on the college system. That is a kind of monopoly. And what do we learn in free markets? Monopolies are what? Bad. They tend to hinder development. So there's a college monopoly on credentials. The other thing I would remove is I would bring back the oral exam. What seems to be the case is the ability to speak is the medium of education that is more paramount than the written test. The majority of people are tested and get grades relative to a written test. Well, that feeds to the written tradition, right? And that seems to be a trivia. So getting an A on the test means you're smart. Well, getting an A on the test tends to mostly be trivia. Even if they're asking critical questions, the critical questions are, oh, did you happen to memorize all the terms? So removing the test in favor of the oral exam seems to be quite critical. It would also seem to be that the teacher in the classroom has to be a host of discussion as opposed to asking random trivia questions. So there seems to be, the first thing I'll say is there seems to be a return of education that's really focused on the oral versus the written. And the oral, and I almost feel like today that because if William Ong is correct, that the very way the brain works changes with information technology from oral to written. Today, where it's like we've gone through the oral tradition, the written tradition, and now we have the net tradition, which is basically the internet. This means you're going to have a new kind of psyche, a new kind of mind. These are loaded terms. A new kind of qualitative experience, which then, if kids are all having attention deficit, if children are having attention deficit disorder problems in classrooms, maybe that's not because there's something wrong with the kids, but because their brains have qualitatively changed in a manner that makes it unfitting to keep them in a written tradition classroom structure. And what you need to do instead is put them in something akin to a hip hop cipher, a dialogos, a circling, or an oral kind of conversation, because that also works on a constant feedback of what is being said with the other people. Oh, and by the way, it's not just the teacher who's talking, you're talking with the other students and yourself. So there's something about, I do think the notion that people have, like Guy, our beloved Guy, Master Pietro, on this sort of notion of dialogus and circling seems to be pointing to a medium of education that is necessary in a net tradition world where the information technology has changed our qualitative experience of the world. And then here's the thing. If the information technology has changed people to think in a new way qualitatively, then what ends up happening right now is they're all bad at written tests, or they can't pay attention, or the classroom. And so you're setting up all of these people to fail or to feel like they're stupid. I would actually say that a big cause of the meaning crisis is people not getting into a good college and feeling like their life is wasted, or getting into a good college and encountering that there are people smarter than them when if they're at Harvard, they've been taught their entire life they're the smartest person ever, and they get to Harvard and they get the first B, so they're fragile. I think the education medium is central in the nihilism, meaning crisis, mental depression, and all of these different things. Because I would also say that one of the reasons people are addicted to social media is because they're trying to get away from the school system, or they're bored in the school system, or they're anxious. Like, there are all these books talking about how unbelievably anxious and miserable high school kids are. They're taking 20 AP courses. They're trying to think that they're just completely overwhelmed all the time, and they're trying to get good at trivia. This is what we've done. We're saying you're only smart if you're good at trivia, but the internet has changed your brain to only be good at dialogos. So then we wonder why there is this inability. You have this break. You have this incredible break. And then guess what this means? This means that the people who do well in school will be the people that figure out a way to cheat their qualitative transformation, or to be what? Shallow, fake, to act like they're good at trivia when they actually don't think according to trivia. Therefore, someone who says dancing star, but they're not actually a dancing star. So that means the people that will then climb the ladder in your society and become president and become senator and CEOs of companies are going to have a kind of hollowness, a kind of emptiness to them, because of the mismatch of the sorting mechanism medium, the association of intelligence, and the enabling that does for those people because of their credentials. So that then leads to a leadership crisis, right? That leads to a institutional crisis, because the people that are at the top are the people who are experts in a form of thinking that is trivia based, as opposed to collective evaluation. So then your leaders can't make any meta evaluation. Of course they can't. The whole reason they're in that position is because they're good at trivia and then playing the system and playing the game. So then what you have is, if the education system continues in its medium to associate trivia with wisdom, then the people who are best at trivia will be your leaders, which is the opposite mindset of collective meta evaluation. And so your leadership will then be following a trivia model, which is completely and utterly inadequate for complexity problems like global warming, like birth rate falling, like the fragility of the system, like Jim Rudd is saying. So then you have this problem. Like the medium of education then leads to the people who are making the decisions having the worst possible mindset for dealing with problems of great complexity, because problems of great complexity, by definition, cannot be understood in terms of trivia, because nobody knows the answer. So you break up the college monopoly on credentials. You basically bring back all testing structures, or the ability to engage in circling with classrooms. The other things I do is we have to understand that the foundation of the economy, like what is the value? It's a dialectic between creativity and energy. McCloskey and Vygotsky-Smil. You can determine a world's, like, if you're on a desert island, you survive on the island because you eat food and you figure out a way to get off of it. So fundamental value is a dialectic between energy and ideas. And the ability to generate ideas and creativity tends to correlate with the ability to engage in rhetoric and creative thinking and not to have trivia. And if innovation is what tends to raise the quality of life, not capital, money, private property, et cetera, so forth, then these things seem to all go together. I've said there is a number of things. So the movement from the trivia mindset by a transformation of the medium to the collective meta evaluation seems to then have systematic implications for different things. I'd be curious what you think.
Yeah, I think all the people who've done good media theory over the last 100 years have pointed roughly in this same direction. That under conditions of a neo-acoustic, neo-tactile, transliterate system, then you need to really rely on oral, right? And I think that's especially important, not just to bypass the problem of enforced trivia through standardized testing, but also now the new problem that the automated information tools can simulate essays and projects of all kinds. Right. So we basically have the human conversation to fall back on, which is, yes, appropriate to the structure that's implicit to emerging network and web technologies, and which is highlighted by the emerging turn toward dialogos type technologies. That's also the situation in which people have the ability, especially if they are themselves good evaluators, to really suss out the different aspects of where a person is at, because the test is not going to show you their emotional or physiological situation or what the interaction between their multivalent internal intelligences are. But that's something you can get a better sense of in an extended period in person with someone. I think it's also the reason we see the turn toward the podcast and the long form interview. Right. I could learn far more about the Ukrainian war by listening to 2 hours of one interesting person who's been there than a year's worth of quick news blurbs, because there's something about the extended format that allows the human brain to start to pick up richness of detail that it can't otherwise get through a formalized information process. So there'll be problems within that structure as well, but I think that's definitely the structure we have to start moving towards. Another aspect of it for me is the necessity, like last time we were talking about enjoying your own subconscious, right? Subconscious intelligence, subconscious evaluation, subconscious agency. This turn, I think we're going to see a lot more of bringing back in the intuition, the magical, the shamanic. Scott Wiley and I are doing a course on this with Parallax in October. But I think we've got to start getting smarter about how we operationalize subconscious exchanges of knowledge and understanding as part of our educational structures. And then the other thing that comes up for me is somewhat analogous to the move from, say, TV and video and movies to streaming services, right? Regardless of what we officially authorize as credentials, there's a need to evaluate each other. And the evaluation has to move from, hey, you took this, was your GPA, now you're sealed in, to it's an ongoing streaming interactive form of evaluation of individuals. Years ago, when I was early in the integral community, I was trying to think about what sort of systems we need collectively in order to produce the wisdom communities that the individuals weren't able to produce, right? If it was enough to have Buddhas, we'd already have a wisdom civilization. There's some kind of collective analog. And I broke it down to a number of different pieces, but one of them I called MIPCIV, which was the massive internal profiling civilization. We need to know a lot more about what's going on inside people so that we can switch to that. But that is an ongoing, evolving, multivalent process, right? You essentially need your information tools to constantly be developing a profile of you in a way that's non-reductive and always updating itself and tracking you across different forms of intelligence. And if we had that, then we can use that for all kinds of social organization processes that we were previously using very crystallized things for. Like, you got this credential, that's a crystallized thing. Or you wear a turban, we don't want you on our plane, that's another crystallized thing. Or we don't let women do those jobs, that's another crystallized thing. Martin Luther King very famously gave this, I have a vision where people aren't judged by the color of the skin, but by the content of their character. We know to say that we're not judging people by the color of their skin, but we're not really very good at judging the content of their character. We have these tools, but we would have to organize and instantiate them at a high social level, because right now, the kinds of internal profiling that are going on being done by governments and private corporations is just one or two of your values. They're not interested in figuring out what's really going on for you or where you could be in the system. They're just interested in how to get some money from you or whether you're connected to this organization. So to massively expand our ability to do constantly updated, non-reductive internal profiling of people so that that data is available for figuring out who should be in what position rather than simple external crystallized metrics.
That was an excellent comment.
I definitely think what's actually happened today is people judge on the quality of your credentials, not your character. So they're not judging on race or sex, but they actually are judging according to status. So there's a major problem here. Let me ask you this. Everything you just said, which I 100% agree with, do you think that falls under the category of meta evaluation?
I think people who are good at meta evaluation are necessary in order to implement a system of that kind. And I think it favors the development of a meta evaluative culture. And I think that the same kinds of social processes that you need to set up in order to run one also sort of runs the other. So I don't think it's a one-to-one correlation, but I think they're largely generated by and serving the same goals.
No, I completely agree. There's always an
issue with these kind of qualitative changes, because the moment they change, there's a multiplicity that emerges suddenly, like at the same time. Like once you like do trivia, there's multifacets of doing trivia. There's memory, there's recall, there's a bunch of abilities. So with a qualitative change, it becomes a bunch of things. Let me ask you this. Do you think it is fair to talk about meta evaluation as the qualitative change as opposed to some other languaging? Because we always have to pick our languaging. Do we think that that works as of this point?
I like it, and it's fun to say.
Me too.
You probably get more traction just in terms of systems becoming more complex and folding in on themselves. Like there's a lot of work done in developmental theories of various kinds that are being stripped down to a very abstract level. The model of hierarchical complexity and its offshoots probably have a big future in terms of how the current system controllers and trivia people are able to hear these messages. So the qualitative languaging is probably pretty good for people who are already on board, but you might need different languaging for the people who currently hold power and are not on board.
No, I think it makes me think of there's the issue in creative writing of coming up with the story. Then there's the writing of the story, and then there's the not make the sentences suck. And there's a question of the order, right? Like you tend to come up with the story and then kind of figure it out. But at the end, they all go together. Again, it's kind of like the Trinity. They're all different, but they're also the same. It's kind of weird. Don't understand it. But well, let me put it this way. Is anything that you described, which I agree with, possible without meta evaluation? Or do they all require meta evaluation at some point in the stew?
I think they all require it, right? Like even to take it seriously, let alone to figure out how to implement any of this stuff, you already need to have a fairly high confidence in the people who are doing the evaluating necessary to bring any of this forward.
Excellent.
I don't think you can make any positive change at all without a massive increase in meta evaluative capacity.
I agree. So then to say an emphasis, because at the end of the day, we're almost always just dealing with emphasis, not exclusion or one or the other. If meta evaluation is necessary, which I agree, it would seem to be justified as an emphasis as a medium of education, to think about what is the medium that cultivates meta evaluation. Because regardless what people do or go or whatever, therefore leaving openness without being totalitarian, it will be a skill that people need. That seems to also fight meaning crisis, nihilism, meta crisis, et cetera, so forth. So the question is the following: what is the medium? So here's the other question: do we think conversation teaches or is more likely to teach meta evaluation than other information exchanges? Because the moment we talk about teaching, there is an information exchange, even a medium, because the medium teaches and you translate it into information. So there's some sort of information change that's occurring. Do we think conversation, not written text, maybe dialogos, there's a million terms for this. Do we think conversation as a medium is more likely to be the medium or arena in which meta evaluation is learned and cultivated?
Yes, for a number of reasons, right? One is that we're seeing that it's the appropriate form of cultural adaptation to the information technologies we have. Two is there's a number of reasons to think the trivia-based system can't work, and the only way to really do evaluation under those conditions is human-to-human conversation. And the third one is the picture of what's going on inside the individual, which is underwrites how we develop wisdom. That's a conversational model as well. If we have different systems, if we have different parts of us that need to be checked, if it's left, right, heart, mind, body, Gardnerian intelligences, whatever that is, conversation is the model of how those systems exchange information with each other as well. So conversation is the model internally and externally, and I think that's because it's perfectly well situated to the kinds of technology that are emerging to take over our information environment.
Excellent. If that is the case, then what needs to occur
is an increase of the conditions or mediums of which make conversation possible. Now, not any kind of conversation, but the conversation that generates meta-evaluation. Now, that's quite loaded, but that would have something to do with it, it would seem, that we need to associate education. Right now, we associate an educated person with someone who's good at a test. I think that's fair to say. I think that's what basically everyone thinks. So the first shift that is being suggested is the subconscious association of the average person needs to be that someone who is good at speaking is an educated person. Now, the question becomes the following: what kind of speaking, obviously, but there's at least some starting, there's at least some sort of notion there. So a change of that thinking. Now, the question I think we also have to ask before pursuing this line of thought is the question of, is there evidence in history that literally introduction of speech transforms the society? Well, if the first case study is William Ong, that the introduction and transformation of speech from oral to written made possible the scientific treatise, but it also made possible totalitarianism, basically. So right there, we see a transformation of the way that people communicate changes the kind of world you live in on all levels. The individual, the system, all. So you have William Ong. That's case study number one. And I think a lot of what we've said so far is actually based on data. We know that brains have changed because of the freaking social media. Aristotle, Judgment of Quietness, all these different things we've referenced it. So we have a case study in William Ong, which you could also say Marshall McLuhan and Kirsch, the English guy, et cetera, so forth. Okay, the second case study that might be useful, that I actually think is extraordinary, is indeed the bourgeoisie trilogy of Dietrich Maclowski. And Dietrich Maclowski asked the following question: why is it between the 1600s and the 1800s, really taking off in the 1800s, did the great enrichment occur, where the quality of life for the average person on planet Earth went from $1 a day to percentage-wise thousands of percent? Now, we're not talking about money, we're talking about technology. Because technology is what makes people rich. Even like poor people on planet Earth now can have access to salt. They can have access to air conditioning. They can have access, not everyone, obviously, but the whole argument, this is an agreed upon sociological fact, that there was an enrichment that occurred. And in her books, what's so extraordinary, and I find remarkably convincing, is he says, okay, was it natural resources? No. Was it science? No. Was it imperialism? No, and she goes through and she makes a case. She says, well, imperialism happens after the Great Enrichment. She says, well, science, you had lots of civilizations that had science, but you didn't see this explosion of the enrichment that starts in Europe, in Holland, that then expands around the world. And you had bursts of creativity and innovation in China, the Ottoman Empire, but not sustained, not like a sustained or continual. Like the problem is now we are so surrounded by technology that we don't even realize how much technology has been invented in the last 200 years. Now, she's not saying that that's all good because now we have new problems in a Hegelian sense, but she's saying from a purely base level, food, shelter, non-spiritual level, that these things have dramatically shifted. And one could argue that having air conditioning is a net good. Now, it makes you unable to go outside when it's 90 degrees, but these things seem to have a fair judgment. It seems fair to be able to say it's better to be able to access coffee than not. So it's called the Great Enrichment. And then that still leaves questions open to these new problems we have with the meaning crisis, and et cetera, so forth. But the main point is the following. She makes an incredibly powerful case that the Great Enrichment is due to simply the following. People changed how they talked. They literally changed how they talked about daily life. And the main idea that she put forth is that the average person starting in the 1800s started talking about every human being has dignity and every human should be free to do what they want with that dignity. And when you tell people that, it turns out that they start inventing, they start solving problems, they start going around, and even like average people start creating things and they start inventing. She goes after Piketty. She has a wonderful debate with Piketty in his book on capital, because as you know, he argues that capital is central. And she actually hates the word capitalism because he thinks it has created the impression that enrichment is due to capital accumulation. And she goes through the different rates and shows that you can't explain it that way. No matter how much wealth King Louis XIV had, he couldn't get frickin' internet, right? Like you're at the mercy of innovation. Now, again, she's not saying all innovation is good or bad, but she's saying that this is what causes the great enrichment. I can listen to Mozart whenever I want, when in the past it was very unlikely I would be born the person who could access Mozart or different things. But the main point is she is literally saying and making a case that ideas and rhetoric, you could say capital R rhetoric, changes the world. That is a sociological fact. This is staggering. Because if what we are saying is that would mean that what we're saying there's actually historical evidence of in William Ong and in Dietrich McCloskey. And now the other book that talks about changing the world is James Hunter's book, To Change the World, where he argues that the thinking of the world is changed by people in positions of influence, like the university, having a faithful presence that then spreads out and changes how people think. And some people accuse that, you'll have like Lindsay talk about wokeism in colleges and, the spreading of the ideas with the Frankfurt School. But actually, that is a sociological fact that you get people in positions of power and the ideas spread out. Here's the difference. And I've been debating this for years, going through Randall Collins and different things. What James Hunter shows you is that a system, like an ideology, changes the average person through systems of power, which is inherently totalitarian, do note, and exclusive. Whereas it is succinct, clear ideas that change the average person, because the average person can understand those ideas and then change how they talk in everyday life. So like a systematic philosophy tends to only change the world when it is situated in a position of power that has faithful presence and then goes out. And you can also think of like Christianity going to Constantine, right? That's like a faithful presence sorts of things, right? So you have that model. James Hunter, faithful presence, tends to work with systems of philosophy. But if you really, really, really want to have a scalable qualitative transformation that is not totalitarian or power-based or trivia-based, which the James Hunter stuff is, not that I'm saying Hunter supports that, he's just doing a sociological analysis, well, then you need succinct ideas that entail with them a call to action, because that then changes how they talk. If people are then allowed to talk, they then have to have the mediums to talk. And this gets into free speech and different things. And then having a school system that encourages people to talk about these ideas. So you have to have an idea, very simple idea. And the idea is, like she puts it, anyone can get this. Every human being has dignity, and people should be free to do what they want with that dignity. It used to be a gentleman was someone who didn't work. Like you had like clout by not working. No one thinks that now. Arguably to a problematic level, because people are now caught in the Paul Virilio. We are, what is George Willis says? He says we're accelerating ourselves to death, right? So there's a problem here. But the notion is that literally the transformation of how people spoke because of a new idea to speak about changed the world, as long as people were then able to speak. The last contextual evidence for this would probably then, on the primacy of dialogue, would then probably be Jonathan Rauch's masterpiece, Kindly Inquisitor, that shows that dialogue is necessary for the evaluation of information. Like you talk about ideas, free speech, sharing of concepts, then allows you to test the concepts to determine what is good and what is bad, and you can't have a testing mechanism. His whole idea, he thinks it's a major problem that people talk about free speech as a expression thing. He says, no, it's epistemologically necessary in order to judge and test and experience ideas to go through them. Like you cannot, basically it's the following. Meta-evaluation following Jonathan Rauch, and he goes through Karl Popper and all these different people, when Popper's at his best. I'm not a huge fan of some of the other books, but granted, anyway. The point is that Jonathan Rauch is saying is that literally the creativity, innovation, intellect of a society is contingent upon the movement of speech, which is the movement of ideas, obviously writing and different things, but the medium of speech. So for Jonathan Rauch, you can't have you could say evolution of consciousness if you want, but you certainly cannot have qualitative change without speech, and ergo the freedom of speech. Dietrich McCloskey gives you historic evidence that rhetoric changes the world and the key is the following. The enrichment was completely mind-blowing. It was a 16-fold increase of wealth in the world. It wasn't just like a ×2. It like blew everything out of the water, that the entire qualitative state of the world changed. So you have historic evidence in Dietrich McCloskey. And then in William Ong, Marshall McLuhan, you also have evidence that speech changes things at scale. So all of these would come together to give a very coherent case that the way that you can have a non-totalitarian transformation of people has something to do with the spread of speech, the enabling of speech, and the mediums in which people speak primarily. That this also, speaking is inherently a practice. That's the other thing. It's inherently a practice. You have to judge what the other person is saying. It teaches social intelligence, emotional intelligence, and that all of these as a medium seem to increase. And then the final thing I'll say, I give it back to you. So I think all of that we're saying actually has evidence. There is historic evidence for it. There is sociological evidence for it. It is not just assertions. There is strong reason to think that, I'll just say rhetoric. The world is made by rhetoric, capital R rhetoric, in the Dietrich McCloskey say, which is an idea-informed notion that people then freely speak about. And also, too, the key with the idea that people have dignity and they should be free, that is also an idea that calls you to act. You know, oh, you have dignity? Well, you ought to do something with it. So if there's a motivation in it, and you ought to get good at evaluating how you should use that dignity and what you should do. So it's not merely an idea such as, you know, human beings are saints or something, or human beings have souls. Well, that's not really a call to action so much. It's a call to action that then changes people in their everyday life. Because if you want to change the world, you have to change how people act in their what? Everyday life. Their immediate everyday life. And if you want to change the world and not be totalitarian, what McCloskey is putting forth is it has everything to do with rhetoric, information flow. So this would be the challenge. I guess this is the challenge that leaves us at. All right. If we accept that historical case, that what is needed is a medium of conversation, of which inherently trains meta evaluation collectively and individually, which would then lead to a qualitative change from the trivia mindset to the meta evaluation mindset, of which is necessary for the addressing, or there's reason to think is necessary for the addressing of the ontological warfare, meta crisis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, then that would require a expansion of rhetoric. The other thing I should note is I actually think Zoom is kind of the negation sublation of the oral written tradition, because you write to cave, like this is recorded, right? So it's oral, but it's recorded. So there's something about net technologies that do have a kind of net, I call it, that have a negative sublative information technology that seems to be the of bringing together sublation of the written and the oral. And so something like this does seem to be what actually does cognitively transform people in a qualitative way. So does education so then it would have to be that education is centered on this. But anyway, this is what we're left with. We're left with an emphasis. We're left with an emphasis on rhetoric, on conversation, of which brings all of these different things. But here's the open question that I would throw to you that I think about a lot. What is the succinct idea that would change how people act in their everyday life, that would lead to an emphasis and practicing of meta-evaluation? Because if we follow Dietrich McCloskey, you cannot change the world with a system of philosophy, because that's always elite. That's always the average person. That's always the theologians. It's an idea, a very simple, straightforward idea that is very consequential. This to me seems really, really a big deal. And you can even see more evidence of that in Hannah Arendt saying that before Jesus, humility was a vice. After Jesus, humility is a virtue. You know, Achilles, it's good to have revenge. After Jesus is not. She's like, and she points out, she's like, those ideas are simple, that the average person can follow and actually has motivation to follow, because then humility, and they don't have power. And, you know, you could get into Nietzsche with the, you know, the sheep and the buzzards and all of that. But anyway, the idea is it was a simple idea that changed people. So what is the simple idea versus system of ideas that would favor the average person then talking and engaging in rhetoric, assuming that the law and systems and mediums are in place to allow the flow of rhetoric, that would then lead to a practicing of collective meta-evaluation that would lead us to different faculties to help avoid all of the different problems that we put forth? That is an extremely open question. I think about it a lot.
Yeah, let's see where I can get to on that. You know, when you're talking about rhetoric, I think it's important for us to have a very expansive idea of what that means, because a lot of that historical period of enrichment came when individuals had books they could read at home, so they could come into the civic space and have a conversation that was informed by another kind of conversation. So we have to figure out how writing and reading fits into conversation, how we do conversations at different scales. You were pointing out that we can record and then even revisit live conversations. I think that revisiting is essential, right? That's what writing has traditionally afforded us, is the chance to go over the thing we want to say. Einstein there used to be this joke about how he didn't really do well early on in school and they thought he had a learning disability, but that traces back to his habit of repeating things under his breath all the time when he was a kid. But that's what he did for the rest of his life too. He wanted to get it right. He was constantly rehearsing how he wanted to phrase things. But what was he checking that rehearsal against? He had some kind of vision. He had some kind of instinct. He was testing that. And that's a kind of internal conversation. I've got something in me. There's already some information and intelligence. I've got this verbal capacity. I'm going to keep running it until I feel a strong match. Eugene Gendlin, who was a psychoanalyst and then developed this thing called the philosophy of the implicit, has a similar sense. He has a kind of Heideggerian notion of embodiment and the proprioceptive felt sense as the source of our intelligence, and then a creative act of experimentally languaging that, looking for a somatic shift that tells you which symbols go with the implicit information you already have, right? And that's a really transformative way of approaching language and approaching knowledge creation with other people. It also ties into the shamanic, because you can use processes like that to try to make the world speak to you. How do you read omens? How do you know what the elemental nature of the world is? You have a strange feeling and you try to figure out the wording that goes with it, so that you're authentically moving your understanding and your relationships forward when you do speech, and not just repeating what anyone could say, which is the flat mode of speech. So I guess what I'm saying is, underneath the difference between effective speech and flat speech is this sense that we are a pluralistic set of evaluation and intelligence systems within ourselves. There's a conversation that has to happen within us so that we're capable of being participants in the conversation, which is the medium that can change the system. So if there was one idea that I think is essential, it would be to conceive of and explore yourself as a qualitative multiplicity, as a set of intelligence systems. I think that underlies all of this, because if that's the thing, if that's the kind of individual agency, qualitative individual agency that's empowering the rhetorical shift, then we're in a very good position. But if we have a very simplistic, homogenous, individual, flat, socialized notion of the self that's trying to run those conversation systems, then we end up either with a simulation of the trivial or a simulation of the new mode. And right, in some ways, that's what Trump was, a simulation of the new on the distributed acoustic resonant mode of conversational thinking. He's just not a good example of it. So there could be a failure mode and a success mode of this shift. And I think the success mode is based on more and more people understanding themselves in various ways as an internal community with different specialized evaluation and intelligence systems within them.
That was an excellent comment. I know we have about 15
minutes left, but you've said so many freaking important things. Without writing, we probably wouldn't have the inner voice, and the inner voice is necessary for the meta. You know, if you look at the difference between the Iliad and the Bible, in the Iliad, and this is brought out by Ockban in Mimesis, in the Iliad, you know, or he talks about the Odyssey, where you have Ulysses, everything, he verbalizes everything, like every detail, every fact, they're just constantly saying everything. Where in the Bible, it's like Abraham took his son and went to the mountain. It's very, very quiet. What the irony is, what actually Auerbach is saying is that in the Greek thought, that there is no written word, there's no inner voice. The only voice is the externalized voice. Whereas in the Bible, in the difference in the literature, which then is bringing about the starting of writing and the reading and the Torah and the scrolls and different things. And what you have actually is the notion of, I don't need to give you all the details because you are reading this and you have an inner voice interpreting what's going on. So you don't have to be told everything. So again, we had to go through writing. This is not a writing is bad, oral is good. This is kind of this negation sublation thing. Writing was necessary for the development of the inner voice, which seems to be necessary for science, writing, and complicated creative thoughts that you had to have for the great enrichment. And now the issue is there's a sense in which you've reached the kind of equilibrium, the exhaustion, like Ebert would say in freak theory, of the written tradition. And what starts to happen is now we have the inner voice, and we need some kind of negation sublation of that. Because if the great enrichment led to us surviving, and, you know, it's like Nicholas Philippe says at the end of his poetry collection, which I really like. He said, in the past, we had to survive to live well. Now we'll have to live well to survive. Well, here's the issue. The great enrichment does not take care of that, because now we're like, it turns out that living well is not a matter of material well-being. Granted, if you're being eaten by wolves, it's difficult to live well. But once you're not being eaten by wolves, which is what the great enrichment took care of, it took care of the material problem. Now you have all the problems of psychoanalysis, Lacan, Freud, et cetera, so forth. So how do we live well? Well, this gets into the question of what we are talking about, the actual ideas that are being discussed. And this is where, so we've established that some sort of exchange of information. Well, there's something, Dietrich Mikowski gives you hope of the possibility of scalable change that is not totalitarian. That's the key. Like, you do see an information technology and how it changes qualitatively the mind, shows you the possibility of emergent world changing, right? On a very concrete level, like it's very concrete. All right, so we know it's possible it is possible. And it would seem to do it again, informed in history. It has something to do with a spread of the medium of an information technology and the prevalence of its use. And the big changes happen when the new information technology is integrated into the classroom. That's the key point. That's what like Neil Postman and them are saying. Once the written word got into the classroom, being educated meant you were literate. So what constituted being educated changed, right? And it also changed how people read, how people learned, and so on and so forth. And that was necessary for the learning of the inner voice, per se. But the inner voice came with the cost of personal interaction, community, socializing. It is very difficult to imagine, I think, therefore I am, before the written word. That tends to come with the written word. Well, now that we have it, now that we've gained those sort of developments, the issue is we're sticking with it because it's what we're used to, and now we've fallen into trivia. And that mindset is inadequate for the complexity today. And the other issue is it's not the mere using of, say, Zoom that results in this change, because they did that during COVID and it was a disaster, right? Because you can't use Zoom to teach tests and memorization because it is fundamentally a technology that speaks against that, right? It is a technology also, that's not the change. You have to change. The content of the education has to match with what you are speaking, with the medium, right? If you use Zoom to do trivia, then that's not the name of the game. In fact, it may make things worse because your mind is qualitatively being changed to be adequate for content you're not being given. Ergo, it makes the meaning crisis worse. Like, I think that's what's happening. Like, everyone is being given the internet. They're having qualitative changes in their mind, but the association of values of the society are the opposite of that qualitative change. So they're in an anxiety, they're at a disarray, they're split, right? They're like a Hamlet split between Athens and Jerusalem, right? This is spreading. Everyone is Hamlet now in that sense. So the content of education has to change. So what it means to be educated has to be changed. And it seems to have so much to do with this collective meta-evaluation. So that being the case, the material changes that there seems to be need to do is, well, it should be noted, like you said about reading, it is fascinating to me that it almost seems like online, there are more people reading Hegel, Lacan, and these really difficult books than ever before. And you're like, why are you doing this? You don't get, you're not getting a job. Like, why are so many people doing this? You see all these YouTube channels of reviewing difficult books. The hope that gives me is in the same way that the evaluator, the meta-evaluator, is inherently attractive. It almost seems like the liminal web space, which entails book 2, all these different things, for me at least, there is inherently an attraction that it brings people, once they find it, to want to read those difficult books, which increases the quality of the conversation, which then leads to qualitative transformations in experience that then addresses meta-crisis, global, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the question. Is the name of the game to get the liminal web in the classroom? The exposure of students in the classroom to the liminal web spaces and these kind of conversations. Is that the material change that has to occur? That's actually a medium change that then leads to these qualitative transforms. Is it simply something like the liminal web? Because it even sees, here's the point, even if people are just watching liminal web videos, it looks to me like it inspires them in the attraction model you put forth to then do it themselves, or to then want to look into those things. Is there something to that? Is it merely a question of exposure? And then, furthermore, if you remove the college monopoly on credentials, somebody at 42 who starts doing this and becomes more capable, then actually can go get a job, can go get employment, can actually start practices and economic models that they are not allowed to do right now because of the college monopoly on credentials. So you remove that, you open up, you spread the internet, so more people have access to these things, and you start changing things. I know we have 9 minutes, but what are your thoughts on all of these fun things we've talked about? I enjoy speaking to you, Layman Pascal. You're so much fun.
Oh yeah. Yeah, this is great. And you know, anytime we want to do this again, I'm having a great time. It's worryingly tempting for me to affirm that the liminal web should be in the classroom.
Yeah, I know. Right?
On the other hand, what is a person going to do except take a stand with the kind of social networks that they find themselves in?
Yeah,
so in that case, yes, absolutely. And I think what we're seeing in the overlapping types of online communities and networks instantiated in various events in real life is a emerging model of how people can co-educate and co-vet each other, which are the basic kinds of things you need an educational program to do. It has to attract, they have to be able to educate each other, then they have to be able to evaluate who's doing it well. And I think we absolutely need more of that in the classroom in various ways. Now, we probably in the liminal web have seen just the tip of the iceberg about how this actually looks, that we collectively are in a process of navigation as well. And some of us are finding things the other ones aren't finding, and we may need to steer into waters that seem more treacherous or more austere. We don't know exactly where it's going, but it is a network of evaluators and meta evaluators. So there's a higher than normal degree of trust in their ability to do that adaptive navigation. But the one thing that I would add into this is, so all of that makes sense with the world that's existed and currently exists. There's also the threat of the world that is about to exist. And one of the most serious problems is the potential for the complete collective sense-making project to break down around immediate, omnipervasive simulation tools, right? We're looking at a world in which it's quite plausible that no information can be trusted at all, regardless of its nature. And in a situation like that, you have to fall out of the trivia of socially available information, no matter whether it's a textbook or a video or a piece of news. Where do you fall back to? You have to fall back to your own evaluative capacity and to conversational networks with other people, whereby you can vet and try to make sense around these phenomena, because the phenomena themselves are going to become increasingly elusive and treacherous. So as particularly when they're trying to actively manipulate people, right? It's a situation that parents face very much, is how am I going to be a good custodian of my child's relationship to digital information systems? How do I make sure that their internal conversation and that the conversation we're having together keeps them safe from what this thing already is and could become very quickly? So there's a sense in which we have to make this liminal in the classroom kind of shift in order to adapt to the world that exists, but it's also a preparatory measure for huge things that are about to shift for us.
I think you put that very well.
One of the reasons why I really like this meta evaluation is because the ability to evaluate seems like it's going to be absolutely freaking critical. And also one of the key skills of like to evaluate the deep fake, the true, the AI, you know, the ontological warfare that Mr. Prager puts forth. One of the things that's lovely, I think that's critical about evaluation is also recognizing what you cannot evaluate so you do something else. Like when you say, well, I can't know if this is true or false, so let me ask the question, does it matter if I know it's true or false? Or maybe I should go plant some tomatoes or something like that. And so there's something else I think about sometimes. And yes, I agree. There's always a temptation of going, just put liminal web in the classroom, you know, in different things, because that's convenient. But there's also the problem that if you didn't believe in it, you wouldn't do it. So the fact that it reflects your bias is always a necessary problem, right? Of course, you're going to tell people to do what you do because you do it. If you didn't think other people should do it. Now, you don't want to be totalitarian about it and say everyone has to do exactly what you do, but there's always going to be some sort of saying people should do this thing because you do it. And why would you do it if you didn't think others should, right? So there's always that quandary, but we also have to be aware of that problem. And also to talk about the liminal web in the classroom is not to say that the given people in the liminal web should be in the classroom. It is the structure and medium of the liminal web that should be in the classroom, right? You know, who knows if who would be there, but that structure of the liminal web. And then the question would be an analysis of what exactly is that structure? What does that structure do? How does it work? And going through the praxis of it. The other things I also wonder is if almost, you know, there's always this problem of people on the liminal web. It's like, oh, how do we get paid? Don't have a job, can't offer certification, et cetera, so forth. I wonder if that's actually like a feature because it helps avoid the bad guru or the transfer dynamics. Like I can't give anyone a job. You know, you go to college, it feels like the professor can give you a job. Like you go, I can't get you into heaven. You go to church, it feels like the pastor can get you into heaven. And that's why maybe the wisdom cults are so likely. Maybe one of the advantages of the liminal web is you have people who are engaging in elevative rhetoric who have to work like blue collar jobs, who actually cannot provide certification. And I wonder actually, like I just run a wedding day. I unloaded trucks for 7 years. You know, we live on a farm. I can't get you a job, anyone. So I wonder actually, if that is a feature in a good way that helps work against transfer dynamics. Now, it might suck for us because you have to make time for all of these things and it might not be sustainable. But the question would be how to find a middle, perhaps, where your job and your income is not, you're not just a professor, because that's always the problem, right? You have these people in college who are just professors and they like don't have souls anymore, right? But likewise, you have gurus who are just gurus and you don't have souls. I do wonder if one of the features of the liminal web is it almost seems to require interdisciplinary sort of living, which might then tie to the meta evaluation, because we were saying earlier that's evaluating many different levels. Now, I do think another material tradition change that's needed is like the work Anthony does. We don't have a pricing mechanism for digital assets. As a result, digital assets like online classes, et cetera, so forth, are susceptible to marketing structures that don't really work. So there's something to be said about needing a new pricing mechanism for digital assets. And Anthony is an intrinsic research who I adore, we work on, because that's a big problem. And you actually mentioned that earlier. But I won't talk about that. But hopefully that's covered on, you know, it's not like not being covered, it's covered there. So first off, I wonder if not having the credentials actually helps work against transfer dynamics and therefore shows maybe that actually increases attraction. You know, we were saying how attraction of seeing the meta evaluator is necessary because people go, wow, they're not doing it for anything external. They must have some sort of inner and extrinsic change that is a qualitative change that is worth getting. Maybe I should do that as well. So it's interesting to think that maybe the suck of not having employment in these liminal web spaces is actually a feature that may help work against some of the problematic power dynamics that have existed in the past. The other thing I do wonder is like the pressures of AI, what's coming, the world to come. Maybe those would be the owl of Nineveh flying at dusk that will force the world to move from trivia to meta evaluation, right? Because if we look at history seems to be a story of humanity not getting their act together until they have to. And maybe in a funny way, AI has the forcing function of the transformation of education to something aligned with meta evaluation, assuming we don't die. Because it would almost seem like that is what is necessary. Because a conversation, like, how do you fake a conversation? Like, I could, I guess, have an AI that could be me talking to you right now because I'm out sunbathing or something. But the information that is being said itself would be real. You would experience it. And then it does seem that conversational information is different from facts. Like a lot of the, like, how do you do fake philosophy? Like, what is fake philosophy? I can think of fake news, fake facts, fake studies, the replication crisis. I can think of all this, but what does it mean to have like fake philosophy or fake integration, right? It seems like those are more difficult to fake, right? And that would also seem like it would be something that therefore people to escape the death of the real, as Baudrillard said, would then seek to get a sense, a taste, a drip of water in hell of reality, right? So it seems more difficult to fake philosophy. It seems like it would be more difficult to fake the liminal web, because even if AI was doing liminal web discussions, the discussions themselves would have content of which would either integrate or not. So there may be a forcing function that leads people in this direction, which would be beneficial. And then the question would simply be, are there laws in place that allow people to spend their time this way? Like if you don't have a monopoly credential, if you don't have a monopoly on credentials in college, then you can spend your time doing liminal web-esque education and still get a job. It's not liminal web or college, right? Like as long as there's a monopoly, people are going to feel like it's either or, and that's going to hurt. So that's a change in the material condition that's beneficial. Then also you have to have a spread of, dare I say, high-speed internet so people can engage in liminal web. And that's why I talk about cone dynamics and different things like that, the change of the medium condition. And you would also have to have a change in the educational classroom that would facilitate these transformations that would lead to a meta evaluation. I think the last thing I'll say as well is one of the beautiful things about emphasizing evaluation is you can only do evaluation if you're alive. You have to go live your life. You have to go in the garden and evaluate the tomatoes. You have to evaluate relationships. If education is about information, I can get that sitting on my computer. But if being a full human being is a matter of meta evaluation, then I have to go meet people. I have to go do things. I have to act. I have to take risks. I have to live. And so I do think that emphasis on meta evaluation and then the mediums of which would suggest that's what constitutes wisdom lend itself in the direction of a full life. Whereas a life of trivia, I don't think one can say that they lived a good life just because they appeared on Jeopardy once. I've enjoyed speaking to you. I see that we're at the top of the hour.
Yeah, I've got half a dozen responses to the stuff you just said, but we'll have to handle that next time.
I would love that. I would love that. We will do it again.